okay, I don't want to waste any more time, and this is a good segue, Christy, to how do you create a portrait. So our team is Matthew, Gwyneth, and myself, history team on veterans and homelessness. So you guys can take it away.
So I'm just going to give kind of an overview of our plan for today. So Matthew's going to start by giving sort of a historical context overview for 5 to 10 minutes, just to kind of frame our methodology and some background information about the history of homelessness and housing throughout sort of the time period that we're looking at with our narratives. Then we're going to switch to talk about the discussion questions. I know we like to talk a lot and spend a lot of time in this session or in this segment. So to try to make sure we have enough time for the pedagogy part at the end, I'm actually going to set a timer on my phone for each of the different sort of sub-themes to talk about. So when the timer goes off, that person just wrap up their what they were saying and move on to the next one. And to sort of help transition between the different topics, we're actually going to show clips from the interviews from our narratives to kind of set the stage and remind you a little bit to start the next part of the discussion.
I just ask very quickly, I think there was a little bit of, there was some miscommunication about some of the readings. Did anybody get a chance to actually review the full transcripts that got sent out this morning?
Only for now.
Okay. Anybody else?
I opened.
I mean, glance.
I did. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Did
okay. Okay. Thanks. That's fine. It's no big deal. It just helps us understand. It helps us.
I watched all of it.
You are.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Is someone on the phone?
Hi, yep,
That's good.
it's Erica on the phone.
Erica, yeah.
I got to read part of them, so.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
Yeah, the transcripts that were sent out initially were just the transcripts of the clips that were assigned, but the website also has transcripts of the full interview from which the clips were drawn, and there's some additional information in that that we'll be drawing upon, but it's neither here nor there.
But this was to watch the clips, right? But that's your plan. That we can talk about. Like the assignment will be to watch the clips.
So I believe the assigned reading, I believe the sort of assignment was a few clips, the full transcripts, and a few pieces.
Oh, got it. Okay.
That was challenging.
Okay.
I struggled to figure out what I was.
Yeah.
Okay.
There
but
was,
to be fair, I was busy. Didn't have a lot of time.
The lack of clarity is not on you. this could have been clearer for me. So do we have a great. I spent a lot of time thinking about which template to pull out of the air.
I do have to say my initial response is, oh, I didn't know before it's
It's not the most recent version of PowerPoint. So.
Oh, I really like that.
Well, listen, this will be fun. This is very much we're going to really appreciate you guys' feedback on this. There was much. Gwyneth made this happen in terms of all the legwork, and Sandy made this happen in terms of telling us, no, really, you have to get started. So there is much, but there is still much to be done in terms of incorporating feedback from everybody. We think as historians, the three of us, and very little of this material is directly historical. But we think that thinking historically and using historical methods is valuable. It allows us to draw upon a variety of different sources and perspectives, a variety of disciplinary contexts, and integrate things into a single narrative that sort of looks at tensions and contradictions and still provides insights, but isn't wedded to any particular theoretical framework. And to the extent that history is inherently interpretive, it allows us to draw connections that might not otherwise be drawn. Generally speaking, historical distance allows us to look more critically at things that are still very fresh in our experience, and political and homelessness among veterans is incredibly emotionally and affectively laden and politically sensitive today. So having a little bit of distance can be helpful in that regard. I just want to spend a couple of minutes, or we just want to spend a couple of minutes at the outset today talking about the concept of homelessness among the big picture of stuff. So homelessness is a modern concept. It's really sort of emerged as a social category in the 80s, but there have always been those who lived without shelter. And just scan it from the beginning of time. So as early as the colonial era and early republic, you had folks who would be transient and not living in sort of domiciled settings. And the most important point in the early republic and the late 18th century, early and mid 18th century was that the idea of a local identity and being connected to a community. So if you were someone known in a community, you would get some support from local civic leaders, not much, but it was common to have some kind of redistribution and some kind of caretaking. But those who were not connected to a community were very much deemed very much discouraged from staying, and and there were legal mechanisms of warning out to actually tell people you have to leave this setting. There's this distinction that abides throughout the years of who was worthy and who was not worthy. So folks like the abandoned widow, the disabled soldier, the seriously ill might get some care or might get some support within a community, but sort of sailors, transient laborers, folks that just sort of blow into town would be told, no, you have to keep going. And here we have a document from 1765 where the selectmen had empowered a constable in Massachusetts to move on. For much of the 19th century, homelessness, what we would think of as homelessness, was really casual labor. So folks would, during periods of economic boom, people would travel to places where there were jobs, whether railroads or any kind of industrial development. And if you were in good health and able to work, you could do this. And there was a thriving culture of there was hobo culture, which was alternately sort of idealized as American rugged individualism on the one hand, or vilified as folks who were political radicals and agitators on the other. This is a photo of a hobo jungle in the late 19th century. For those who were unable to support themselves, poorhouses in urban areas were sort of the option of last resort. It kept people from being frankly street homeless, although that of course existed as well. Similarly, in times of economic crisis, which the sort of economic boom and bust of the 19th century, the recurrent economic crises, homelessness became what we would consider homelessness was more of a visible issue. And particularly as urbanization progressed and you had more folks who were unsupported in urban areas. So in terms of our modern understanding, the Great Depression was a pretty significant event just in thinking about poverty in the United States. And one of the themes we're going to see today is just how much homelessness is really about the problem of poverty. So the distinction between worthy and unworthy gets eroded by the Great Depression, because suddenly huge numbers of formerly self-sufficient families and individuals are rendered dependent and unable to care for them, unable to house themselves. Many are searching for work. You have work encampments. The Grapes of Wrath sort of illustrates is the classic fictional narrative for this. I should say in passing, during the 19th century, veterans, of course, were among those who were working, seeking labor, and who were occasionally unable to support themselves, whether because of physical disability or otherwise. So in one of the readings, the Marjorie Robertson, she comments on how, I think it was Marjorie Robertson, one of the recommended readings, that veterans have historically been slightly disproportionately represented among itinerant workers and those without housing, in part because veterans are men and these populations are overwhelmingly male. Until recently, veterans are still overwhelmingly exclusively. So the intersection of veteran identity and housing and life without shelter goes way back. 1932, you see the Bonus Army come to Washington, D.C. And for those of you So this is a group of World War I veterans and their supporters who marched down Washington seeking redress for their economic vulnerability, for their economic status. They had received bonuses, a bonus ticket for their service that they weren't able to cash in until 1945. And the demand was, we want it now. We serve the country, we want it now. And so the encampment in Washington, D.C., many of these folks, some of these folks were housed elsewhere and came to Washington, D.C., but this too was drawn from populations that just weren't able to house themselves. And and Herbert Hoover reacts and has the army and the D.C. police clear the bonus army from D.C. and it has massive repercussions for his political future, also for our ideas about entitlements of veterans. This is what's related to foundations for the GI, actually. But it's a key moment where veterans are using their identity to say we have a claim on assistance here. And it goes back before that to the National Homes for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers and Sailors, and there's literature on this, the early welfare state and Civil War pensions. But this is a very public moment at a time when lack of access to housing is something that is relevant for everybody, or for a much wider population. World War II didn't erase homelessness, but the economic growth that began in the 40s made this much less of an issue. Housing, work was available, housing was reasonably available, particularly for veterans after the war. The public thinking about homelessness in the post-war period, the public image of homelessness was Skid Row. And these were areas in cities where they were often in marginal areas of the cities, very localized. And there was an ethnographic literature on them. The sociologists were very interested in them. The population that came to mind for most folks were old white alcoholic men. And that was sort of the dominant understanding of what homelessness looked like throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Now, the late 70s and early 80s, the very late 70s and especially the early 80s, witnessed the emergence of what we would think of as homelessness and what at the time was thought of as the new homelessness. The key features here were appearance of people without housing in public spaces that had previously not seen them. And the causes for this were multiple and varied, but the population too was slightly different. Slightly younger, more representation of racial and ethnic minorities, more women, more people with what appeared to be serious disorders of thought and emotion. And this gets linked to the arguments about deinstitutionalization. And this is really where we begin with our understanding of the homeless crisis in American history. So there are continuities here, but there is something new about the phenomenon, at least as it's recognized as a policy issue in the 1980s. No one was writing exposés in the papers about the homeless in 1893, but it very much was a public issue. A lot of hand-wringing. This is the same, I couldn't find a good picture to represent this, but this is also the time when the sort of troubled, neglected, scorned Vietnam veteran is also sort of becoming a public image, is becoming a common trope. This is particularly clear in the movies. Think of Rambo, right? Before he goes on his killing sprees. He's itinerant, and he's got his backpack, and he's troubled, but he's noble, and win this time, Sarge. But there was one particular case that of a Vietnam veteran who had ended up committing some serious crimes. So hadn't gotten much care, and so his image was held up as a stand-in for the situation of the veterans. You're nodding, Mike. I couldn't remember his name.
Is it the one you're not thinking of? Was there a film made of it?
No. I remembered him late last night and couldn't get the details in time. So here you see this intersection of sort of national guilt over how do we treat our boys after they came back from this terrible war, together with new visibility in public settings, and the deinstitutionalization context. And very few of these veterans would have been people who would have been in state hospitals 40 years earlier, but nobody's really drawing that distinction. This sort of sets us up for, this is the cultural grammar that we're drawing from when we're thinking about homelessness today. 1980 is very different from the late 1990s and early 2000s, which is what righteous dopamine comes from, which is very different from the mid-2010s, which is what our narratives come from. But there are commonalities, and it's worth sort of being able to draw upon them. Let me just say, where am I in terms of time? Okay, just the last thing I want to say is that this Wright does a nice job here, just in terms of setting the stage, of thinking about what it means to be homeless. And it's not, we all have sort of an intuitively obvious, or an intuitive understanding of what that means. And it's not exactly like pornography, but we think we know it when we see it. It's offensive in the same way. But you guys get that reference, right? Okay, I'm not just
It's actually
talking
very
about,
appropriate, right? Because the whole point of that is that you don't really know, like,
right. Yeah.
like it.
I'm not just talking about pornography for the hell of it.
Right.
Um,
I like it.
Very helpful.
it is.
Applies to a lot of stuff.
And there's something deeply offensive about homelessness.
Yeah, Sam, it's
Morally
very useful
offensive.
metaphor.
Yeah, I like it. I don't like it.
Right. Okay, good. Mission accomplished. But if there's one thing that I hope we take a variety of things away from looking at this material and discussing it. But even if it is just thinking critically about what constitutes homelessness, that, like a typology and sort of unpacking that, that's worthwhile. So there are the literally homeless, right? There are those who have no place that is fit for habitation to lay their head on any given night, sleeping in shelters, abandoned buildings, vehicles, on the streets. And that may be for a brief period, or it may be for years. And that is a distinct population. And there is as Wright talks about, and this, Wright is talking in 1989 about what was going on at the time. But it's still apt. There's a much larger population of the marginally housed. So folks who are crashing with friends, folks who are staying in welfare hotels, or staying in welfare hotels for a couple weeks and then in their car for another. People in therapeutic or carceral institutions, people who at any given moment may be without shelter, but who are not without shelter on that night. And the veterans in our narratives underscore this. Do you want me to go into that? Should I keep going and talking about the narratives, or should we, because there's this last section is really about the veteran narratives about Cordell and Don, or should we?
Let's wait.
Let's wait.
Yeah.
So we can talk about that. I think that'll come up along the way, but I wanted to sort of set this typology out here before we sort of launch into our discussion. So.
I have a question,
Yeah.
a historical question. So we went for a period of time where Bechdel rose about the second subtract, which would have made homelessness. Well, I'm just wondering, culturally, historically, in terms of thinking about societal obligations, if Medicaid say, well, we were concerned about for children. You know, can you talk a bit more about the moral attitude towards homelessness and who does society owe something?
Can we wait on that? Because that kind of ties
Yeah.
into our discussion.
It does.
before.
Yeah. And these are big. This is a big question.
Yeah.
To whom is owed basic human sustenance, and what constitutes basic?
And I would imagine too, along with that, who becomes representative? Which
That's
figure,
the question.
right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead.
All right. So, Shay, can you cue up the first clip? The first clip is Cordell clip 7.
Yeah. There was One point that I forgot to mention, one of the things that's unique about the early 1980s compared to earlier periods, this is a time of this is a good economic time. This is not the Great Depression. So there's something really dramatic about the appearance of the street, those living on the street at a time of great economic expansion. And that's not, that too is some things are new.
So our first question is about the dynamics between the individual vulnerabilities that are in anyone that's homeless experience and the social and structural determinants of health and how those sort of play together. So based on what you read, for those of you that read the whole narrative or for those of you that just watched the clips or the abridged part of the narrative, based on the Cordell and Don's narratives, what social structure factors do you really think contributed to their ability or their inability to be housed?
So would you see that? So yeah, that's a big deal. Yeah. So would that be? I mean, where would you place that? Would you place that in terms of individual factors, or would you place that in terms of social structural determinants?
What did you say?
I would say structural.
Oh, I didn't get the word.
He's a felon.
Oh.
So say more. Or anybody.
Okay. I mean, that one, to me, it seems really, it's a pretty clear one. I mean, he talks about it so clearly in one of the other clips or part of the transcript. He basically just says, I can't get housing because I'm a felon. It's illegal, but they shouldn't be able to keep me from getting housing, but they do. And they say, I can't get housing because I'm a felon.
How do they deny it?
They say, you can't live here because you're a felon.
So who asks?
The people who, the rental people.
Yeah, there's a real sort of process there. Yeah.
And that they themselves are unaware of the HUD policies, right? Of the federal policies that prevent housing discrimination against felons, but that on the local level, as it gets implemented, those policies don't seem to matter.
Well, one of the things I think is very interesting about the way he talks about it is how frustrated he is and how he talks about the different states and how it's like in this state versus that state, and he knows the nuances of these kinds of things, but it still works out on I'm actually writing a paper about this right now, but the informal practices versus the structural policies and how that actually plays out. And so that's kind of one of the things that's very interesting here. But I would say from a structural level, there may be policies in place that keep you, there are actually places where the structural policies keep felons out of housing, number one, that does exist, but also the informal practices related to the structure also.
So this would be an example of, he's talking very clearly here about the informal practices.
In this case,
yeah.
I think.
So what would a large-scale structural issue, what would an illustration of a large-scale structural barrier because of a felon history? What would that look like?
Somebody else.
Like employment?
Yeah, employment, job, being able to get a job.
Yeah, right. You can't vote.
But there are places where you actually can. Is it illegal everywhere that you can't deny people housing based on their felon?
I think his point here is that if a landlord is accepting HUD money, they can't.
Right, but
That's
so that,
federal.
but that also could count, like, I guess my point is that could be a structural thing too. There are, you can also have, in this case with HUD money, that's true. But it could also be a structural thing that you can deny people based on your past history.
So
right?
the
Those
same,
both.
the same issue with people with disabilities is, I think, parallel here, where you may have a law, and the law may say you can't discriminate, but the person who's being discriminated against may not have the power, the resources, and tools to even be able to find a complaint.
Right.
And you actually, I think, was it Cordell or Don who was talking about feeling like he'd been treated unfairly, and he tried to advocate for himself. I think it was Don when he was talking about the bedroom sex. And, you know, you reach a point where you know that you might have a case, but what do? You're poor, you're not connected, you don't have power, so you end up not being able to fight the quote.
Right. The level of recourse. And that is a structural thing too, right?
Yeah.
So
Access.
access to recourse. Yeah. You can't afford a lawyer, maybe, you know, you don't know the channels, and you're trying to fight for so many other resources that you need that maybe, you know, you don't have the bandwidth as well. But yeah, the level, sort of what structures exist to get recourse, to have recourse. Are there free lawyers available to fight housing discrimination against felons? Maybe. So,
And how many?
Yeah, no. So, but this is great, right? And absolutely, this is structural. In terms of history, though, and looking at the trajectory over time, why is Cordell a felon? I mean, this involves some speculation. It's not all in the
I
system, but
think we're speculating.
right. Yeah, I mean, we know this is speculation, but it's reasoned speculation. And in 1940, would he have been a felon?
But it's not speculation, right? I mean, he was released because of changes.
no, that's
Right.
right.
Yeah.
That's Carter.
Getting my,
Yeah.
okay, sorry,
it's
just
okay.
kidding.
It's okay. Yeah. So
There's
what's,
lots of narratives.
Yeah.
so why do we think he has these 3 felonies on his record? Not just in terms of his actions, but why did his actions during this time land him felony conviction?
It's just the 3 strikes are out.
But so what is that an example of?
Well, low. I mean, what we would think of having like no drug dealing capabilities, but having something on you, being arrested the second time, again being seen as a dealer or possession, the 3rd time you're in jail.
And would that have happened in 1920?
No.
It's following the war on drugs.
Yeah, it's the war on drugs.
Yeah, and mass incarceration. Yeah, and this is very much part of one of the dominant facts of life of the poor in the late 20th century, is the intensive policing of their communities around substances. What else is going? What else do you see in terms of structural or individual vulnerabilities in their interaction for Cordell?
Well, it's kind of interesting when we think about that structural component of like 3 strikes, ending as a war against drugs. Right, so there's a whole structure there that puts people in jail. But,
Nothing.
but there isn't a structure that helps them once they're out at all, right?
Yeah.
There isn't any safety net or any, again, access to recourse. But there isn't rehabilitation. Recidivism and all that's going to happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's moral judgment. Not treated the selfish, not compassion, not
Absolutely. Is that structural?
Yeah.
How so?
I think cultural ideas, attitudes are by policy, by way we talk about things,
Sure.
you know, and I think the dominant culture frames to a certain they stereotype people.
Sure.
That's
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to what does it mean to be structural? Are we talking about sort of political economic regimes, or are we talking about sort of structuralism in terms of ways of thinking and culture? And sort of just sort of maintaining some distinctions along those lines is useful. But yeah, so the sense in which it is structural.
What's the cultural? You see, I liked when you said cultural grammar, right? There's so much cultural grammar here, right? And the dominant grammar, the grammar of the landed, so to speak. I mean, we're not talking like the class here of the.
I would argue that maybe it is the landed class, right? I mean, it's a time of retrenchment. It's a time of increasing uneven distribution of wealth.
And that's an important point, because this is also a time when the real dollar value of entitlements is decreasing. As some, I think Hopper and talked about in his article, and also I think that is very much sort of straight structure.
Yeah, right. And gentrification, right?
Yeah. So Cordell gave up his housing, and he thought, I can find something.
So I would say that's an issue that I think is judgment.
Sure.
So if you were to think about going back and doing that, to go out and find housing, or he gave up the spot. At last, he felt so unsafe that he felt being homeless. But he had no choice.
What other people think about that?
So that was what I was going to say. I found that part of the transcript and the part where, as an interviewer, I screamed to ask more questions.
Oh, God, yeah.
Because you know,
BA thesis, by the way.
oh,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
is so much.
Yeah.
Because you know, somebody got murdered.
Yeah.
Like what? You know, that's scary. But then also, like, okay, so why did that make you want to be not in that place? Like, what's going on in that particular house that makes you want to leave? Like, what made you think that you'd be safer on the street than in this particular space? And that, to me, it seems like that was about his individual reaction to it. But I would have wanted to understand more, like, you know, what was it about this home that made, or this apartment complex,
yeah.
right? About this apartment complex that then made you feel unsafe versus, right? And I think that piece was really, and it did feel individual as opposed to structural, which I think is like,
yeah, but I was thinking, I mean, because there's no clear sense that there was an investigation done. I mean, that could have all just been not asked.
Yeah.
But it seems as if it just was a common occurrence, or he thought this is going to happen more often. And the cops didn't really show up in the way they should have. And so
my feeling was that this was probably drug related, and the mantra for people who are in recovery is staying away from people, places, and things, and that suddenly this was a place.
And then he sees himself back in jail.
Yeah.
So it's easier to be on the street almost. Safer.
Well, but his first thought was, I'll find another place.
Yeah.
But also, like, I mean, it can be structural too, because if you think about finding another place, and this could also be my own functionality, but like, you have to pay, right? Like, there's a lot of money that goes into like securing a new place, right? And so for a lot of people, like moving your stuff, like for a lot of people, they actually can't afford to put a deposit on a new place until they move out. And so like the intermittent period of like, I'll just figure it out until I get that money back so I can move it somewhere else. Like yes, it's an individual choice, but it's certainly structurally conditioned by precarity or sort of not having disposable resources. Yeah.
And I think this brings us into our next question, asking about precarity, homelessness, and substance abuse. So let's think a little more broadly than just Cordell and Don, and bring Carter in it too, from righteous doping. So how do you think that, looking at, you know, not necessarily the social structural, but their obvious precarity, their homelessness or transient housing, and their, you know, at least Cordell and Carter's history of substance abuse, how did those sort of all interact and feed off of each other in their
Part of what made him so curious is that also many of their personal relationships, I think, largely drug use. But, you know, you had somebody you could call and say, I'm in between housing, stay there for a week, you know, some that you're estranged from, or that feels very different than having nobody you can really call. So their histories somehow also make them befriended and more vulnerable.
Well, they probably stole from them something last time. Right? Addiction is a beast.
And there's also the cultural narrative that the family should be cutting them.
Tough love.
Best thing to help them.
Enable.
Yeah.
But I forget who, they do stay at their sister, Carter stays at his sister's, right?
Yeah.
And doesn't Dawn also stay?
It's a girlfriend with Dawn.
Done one.
And
Done
Dawn's
those.
girlfriend came out, right? After a couple months.
Because he wasn't paying rent.
Yeah, because he wasn't sleeping with her.
Well, actually, it was him that felt bad about sleeping with her to have a house, a roof over his head, which I thought was interesting. That, am I right? That was.
I believe Don.
Yeah.
It was, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, he was like, I'm sorry, I'm not going to do this for you so that I can have a house, a roof over my
Yeah,
head.
it was something like, I'm not in a place right now where I'm ready for a relationship. Like, my life is falling apart. I can't, like, he just gotten out of, like, treatment for suicidal ideation or suicide attempt. And he's like, I can't relationship right now. And she says, okay, fine.
And I think that context of like the importance of social support in this in order to be able to have a place to stay, but then the social support that you do have, they don't know what the best way is to actually support you. So that idea of I don't want to enable, but you need a place to stay, but does that mean that you're going to steal from me and go do something? And I think, you know, I think that providers too, that transition that's happened from, you know, if you're going to come into treatment, you have to be completely clean, otherwise you're out. But now it's this idea that we accept you where you are, you can come in and out, you can come in high, and we're still going to take you in. And so it's that transition of both cultural understanding and then in response structures that are adapting. And I don't think people really still know the best way. I mean, I've had students say that in context with people with addicts, and one thing that says, as a physician, how can I, or like I have a friend that's in and out of addiction. What is the best thing I can do to support them? People don't know the answer to that. So I think that's what.
Very hard on the family.
And I think there's also a internalized message from the cultural norms about what it means to ask for help when you're an addict. This is entirely from personal experience. This was pretty hard for me to read because my best friend from when I was little was a heroin addict in the late 90s and early 2000s and was living in a variety of places on the street. And we found out after she had left New York, where I grew up, that she had been there for at least a couple of months, maybe up to a year, within like a mile or two from me and my parents, where she had previously lived. And she said she knew that we were there and was too ashamed to come find us because she didn't want us to see her.
Shame runs through this.
Right, so stigma is a later kind of conversation in homes, but I think that's a big piece that I felt like as I was reading all of these shame and how we feel about felons, about
I do think it's interesting that the ethnography, the righteous dope kind of paints a different picture. It's like with not just the shame, but the manipulation. And I think it's interesting to look at these three cases and see how they all sort of view their situation differently and use their own, like, you know, I'm thinking of Don. He seems like such a stand-up guy. He would never, like, in my limited knowledge of him, he would never manipulate somebody to get what they wanted, right? Like, he felt bad about calling the police when he needed to get into the shelter to have them put him in the shelter because the doors were closed. Like, he doesn't seem like one that is used to working the system. Whereas, you know, in the Righteous Dope team, you have Carter and his friends that are making up stories about being Vietnam veterans and, you know, this interaction between the ethnographers and the homeless population and how, like, you sort of have to enable them a little bit, but not too much because then they'll lose respect for you, and like this sort of street code that they have, I thought was really interesting.
It's worth thinking about what structural factors produce those different subjectivities, right? Why is it that the folks in the Edgewater Homeless act the way they do, as opposed to Don? What's different about their circumstances? Is this where individual pathology or individual choices determines it, or are there structural aspects?
I would say one thing that you're talking about parity that I noticed is the first page or two of the transcript of Cordell, he talks about being drafted, and there's this like very poignant piece about the guy who got sent home with his body back.
Yeah.
It's so destabilizing, that part of the story where he's like talking about how they were thinking about signing up for Marines, but they didn't even have time to before a guy got his body sent back, and then he got drafted. It feels so precarious to me. Like it feels like his life was so sort of not even his own to make choices. And so to me it feels like that's the beginning of his story as we hear it, and then he's a 3-time felon, and then so it feels like the whole story is precarious. And anyway, so I don't know if it's individual or structural or whatever, but that part of his history, of his personal history, in amongst the larger United States history, it's a really interesting one. The draft in particular.
Well, and two, there's such a tension between individual choice and agency here in the structure.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a tough one. I mean,
Where do you see it?
well, it's like if you're lying about being a vet, you're doing that to get something that you may need, like a roof over your head or something. I mean, it's understanding the system, understanding the structure, and learning how to navigate them, scale them, maybe.
Access to life-sustaining resources. What's interesting
So
here.
one of them, I'm sorry, but one of them fakes having a heart attack, right? To get into the ER. He says,
Don.
Is it Don?
Don,
Yeah.
when he flees to bed bugs and goes to the ER and says, "Oh, my arm problem."
Right.
Yeah.
So he knows to say that his arm is I don't know, numb or whatever the symptom would be to get admitted, so he could have a blanket and food, right, and to get away from the shelter. So that's also learning the system to get life-sustaining resources.
There can also be a component of using what you know about what is approved by the system to make sense of your own experience. So if you have experienced childhood trauma, but you don't know that that causes PTSD in the same way that being in the military does, it makes a lot of sense to use that as a life story to make sense of what you're going through and how you act.
That's
Or
really
it's like a
interesting.
culturally accepted thing.
Yes. Yeah, I was raped by my father does not give me the same cultural status as I took a round
I served the
Nam.
country.
Totally.
Yeah.
You're right.
And
What
this
else
gets
do-
into
what
the
else is-
martial citizenship, right? Which I don't know if I'm jumping.
No,
but-
ready?
Okay, ready? Yeah. Time for martial citizenship.
But what else does if I have childhood trauma and I also have military trauma? Certainly the cultural valence of those is different. What else might be different when we're thinking about structure and access to resources?
Well, just that there aren't.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, there are disability payments. There's
Yeah.
money with a PTSD diagnosis. If you got it. And if you're poor and desperate, God, who wouldn't try that?
Well, and I do even think the street really creates any kind of scenarios that would be traumatic.
Yeah.
Someone being shot in front of you.
But bring that up because it's true.
Well, yeah, and I just,
It's
I
not
mean,
like the
like-
entitlements don't come right away.
no, like the benefit systems are, maybe a year conservatively to get access to the benefits, then another 2 years to get access to Medicare, or Medicaid,
Either one.
either one.
Yeah.
So the average wait time and this is
For
like benefits. Most
For
people get
SSDI,
denied for SSDI.
SSI,
Most people get
yeah.
denied at least twice, and then
Yeah.
have to have the resources to hire a lawyer to then go back to fight it. And there's certain like waiting periods
Yeah.
between each of
Yeah.
these before you can refile, and then there's a 5-month waiting period between like when you file and when they sort of determine, and then they'll like so. I mean that process itself, like even if there was a clear diagnostic category that you could access, I mean that's like conservatively a year minimum, and then you have to somehow come up with, in order to still be eligible, come up with enough access to healthcare to that not have that eligibility called into question because you have to keep proving that you're right, like all of those things. But
The only thing I would add to that, though, and I don't know the answer, maybe you do, Matthew, is does that apply to veterans? Do veterans have a different channel?
Yeah. So service-connected disability is a parallel social welfare system.
Okay.
Most of the dynamics apply.
Okay.
The wait time is slightly less now, and there are veteran service organizations that work very hard to help people with their applications. Whereas in the public sector, it's usually there's now a whole legion of lawyers who will help people get on disability in order to get some of the money themselves.
Service connected, what you see.
Yeah. So, and the financial stakes are high. So 100% service-connected disability is about $3,100 a month. You don't pay taxes on, which is. Do you guys know what SSI is? Like $750.
Yeah.
And SSDI is like $1,000 or $2,000.
Well, SSI was it depends on the state, right?
SSI, no. Well, it's generally in the same.
Does it? I don't know. Do you know?
I think it does.
Yeah.
I think that SSI is
Depending on the state.
pretty connected with medical ability as well, and with the geographic cost of living. It's always going to be on us.
Generally not more than
A Medicom, oh, maybe you can do
I
it.
was gonna say, can we move on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because my timer
Yeah,
went off.
yeah,
You totally did. I've been waiting for you.
Okay,
yeah,
Sorry,
yeah.
That's okay.
I want to know what martial citizenship is.
right,
That's
okay.
what I want to know.
Well, is that in our glossary? It is, it's in our glossary. So, martial citizenship is the idea that military service affords the soldier a higher level of governmental services, material assistance, and social obligations. Historically, governments have upheld veterans as embodying ideal citizenship because of its patriotism and sacrifice to the nation. So, I'm really glad you asked that question, so we can point out our glossary.
Well, so I did make it past the references. That is extremely helpful. Love it. I'm Jesus. I'm excited.
So now that you all know what martial citizenship is, we basically just want to talk about the particularity of homelessness among veterans. We've talked about the homeless population in general. We want to talk about the specific kind of issues around homelessness within veterans and really tying in our scholarship pieces as well with the narrative. So the first question is really to get at your own perceptions of what it means to be a veteran.
You want to do a clip?
Oh yeah, clip. Clip is from Dawn this time, number 13. So thinking about just veterans in general, do you think that there is a hierarchy within being a veteran, that some even within veterans are more deserving than other veterans? As a society, we show through these entitlement and aid programs for veterans that they are more deserving than non-veterans for social services. But what about within the structure of veterans?
Talk about it.
I just feel like I say this all the time. Yeah, there's a great version where there's a homeless vet who is like she fixed computers, something like that. She fixed computers and lived in her car, and it was like a whole thing. She denies that she was homeless because she lived in her car, but there was a whole discussion of whether or not she was homeless. So it was one of these, marginalized, not totally homeless kind of things. They unpacked that. But they also had a sort of long conversation about whether or not she was deserving, and they argued that she was. She didn't feel that she deserved the benefits of, basically the other vets because she hadn't fought. So literally, it's like word for word, and not even subtly. It was like very unsubtly done. But I mean, it's the same argument, which is kind of neat that they did that.
If you acquire your ability to combat, you have higher status. And if you're or if alcohol drugs that would have been viewed as weakness of character. I think you even heard, I think, of another clip that the judgment of the team that's about their attitude and some of them of the system. And there was critical feelings about people who felt just military taking care of.
That's what Don attributes his depression to. He's like, well, I used to think like that, but that got me really depressed. It's crazy.
I think race definitely play a role, and I think when they both talk about the racism experience in the hierarchical relationships, heavy discomfort in the car with a teenage in it, that's very important.
I do think, though, that the piece to me that seems very, very salient, the seeing combat versus not. There's a very, very strict, which is so interesting to me. I think that a lot of the care work and stuff that goes into it is so important, and some of the places that people experience most trauma. And so it's interesting to don't see that as worthy, as worthy of status.
What do you think that says about society as a whole? And thinking about historically, during like World War I, World War II, like most of the veterans that you would see had to combat during wartime because a lot of the administrative positions, that kind of thing, were actually by, the women volunteers. So you didn't have drafted or enlisted doing those positions. As things changed, that sort of altered where you have a bigger mix now of veterans that have and haven't seen war. So what do you think it says about our society as a whole that we value that over, or value combat contributions or over support of the military?
I think it's kind of, for me, it's I think we don't want to think about combat at all, and so, and we don't want to feel bad about veterans. But if we're going to feel bad about them, they better have been through battle, mostly hurt, right? And because those are really, you can forgive them, but the rest of them are freeloaders. They think they deserve something. And this isn't me, right? But that it's a way that culturally we kind of push away the ugliness of war and what we require these people to do. It's informing that.
So we other them by idealizing them.
Yeah.
Well, too, if you think of popular culture and representation. So.
Well, and you idealize them too, and they're not perfect. But the perfect veteran, the poster boy for being a good veteran, but has been through battle, right? I mean, that's complicated too.
I think masculinity plays a huge role here.
Well, we don't value care work ever, really,
Right.
either. So, I mean, I think it's not,
Mm-hmm.
I guess to me, it's not super surprising that we would value the uber masculine fighter. Like, there's a lot of really good, sociology about this, about why we don't value women's work, but also work that we see as not uber masculine in this arena that we see as, in some ways, the most indicative of masculine workplaces. Like, the military is the masculine workplace. So, and women still don't see combat very often.
The question these days, the question is, what does it mean to see combat? You know, if you're a transport driver driving down a road littered with IEDs, but you never fire your weapon.
Right.
So the lines are blurring now too.
Well, and there's people, a lot of women who actually are pushing buttons and firing
Exactly.
stuff, right? So that which counts? Where does it count?
Yeah, this hierarchy of trauma.
You think it matters? So let's say you have veterans that are both combat savvy or have seen combat, right? Drafted versus volunteer. Do volunteers or drafted deserve more based on how they entered the military?
And I think if you even go back to the Civil War, there are so many stories about, like, the Iron Brigade, how the injured and they go right back, and the injured right back. You know, they were real, patriots, and they weren't going to also allow their seats and old, which others, parents would buy off. I don't know what to call it, but I think that
Classism.
but I think that there was a hierarchy in terms of people who were volunteering and standing up to the war. They were tougher and more manly.
Do you think that still holds in a post-Vietnam era? Because there's this other discourse of the I didn't ask for this.
Right. Well, think about Kyle, the guy who's a sharpshooter. He's so glorified.
Right. In a war without a draft.
Yes.
Well, but I think too, I mean, it gets to the question of choice. Like Cordell talking about why he even joined the military, and then also just considering other veteran stories. Like some people join voluntarily because they don't have other option, or they've been marginalized for other reasons. So then I feel like you could argue, is it really choice to volunteer or not? Or is it your only option to get out?
And I think that's been true for many the demographic analysis of who has signed up since 1990. We're talking about people who don't have ways to college and to training, to higher education, have out of their situation.
It's a good job.
I wouldn't be part of the timer, but the one thing I would say about this, I really think it's about here versus other spaces in which there are draft, where gender is different, et cetera. So I always think of Israel, but other
required
where
military.
you required military, where you have combat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of that kind of stuff would be a really interesting to how this kind of works. Not for this portrait, but just
Yeah.
Well, there's even class within joining up, because I know a number of students in medical school who join up.
Yeah.
Right, to get their free medical school, but they're going to be at a completely different level.
Yeah.
With
You
that
enter
kind of
as an
investment.
officer.
Yeah, with that kind of investment, right? You're never going to see battle. Well, they're going to try to keep you away from it.
Yeah.
You could.
Yeah. So volunteer versus draft, combat versus non-combat,
We're talking about men versus women as well.
men versus women,
Race.
race. Yeah. Although historically this has been one institution that's done a reasonable job. let me put a less bad job along those lines. Discharge status. So
Yeah.
honorable,
Like a dirty job or something,
general,
or-
under honorable, other than honorable, dishonorable. You have to do something pretty bad to get a dishonorable discharge.
Or be gay.
Fair enough.
Especially now.
Well corrected.
It's all back.
And then the issue of mental health. has
Physical,
also
yeah.
been really problematic.
Which brings us to the next
Great
point.
notes.
Yes.
Which brings us to talking about stigma, yes, and homelessness. So this isn't, thinking obviously with veterans in the front of your mind, but think about the stereotypes that you have. Oh wait, I lied. Cliff. Dawn, Cliff 9. Getting ahead of myself. So I picked this clip just because I think he does a really good job of sort of telling what his perceptions of the homeless are that he's experienced in the shelter. And it's interesting that he sees himself as separate from this group. Whereas I think larger society, he's at the shelter, he's homeless, they would characterize him as part of this group. So thinking about, how do, what society generally stereotypes as homeless, right? I think that from the righteous dope fiend is more kind of like the general stereotype of what people think homelessness to be. And I think that Don and Cordell sort of combat this a little bit. So how do you think that, the narratives that we picked really reinforce or reject these different stereotypes that we generally have about homelessness?
Both of them reject it because they're very articulate. Interesting backgrounds in terms of work and education, experiences and aspirations. They present themselves well.
They're clean. That's not that's sort of trivially true, but actually very important when you think about the folks in righteous dope things.
Right, you're not. Cordell is not on drugs.
Okay, right.
Cordell is in.
Oh yeah, no, I mean
No,
literally,
but what do you
not
mean?
just metaphorically.
Okay.
I also think they both demonstrate.
Yeah.
That's
what I
what I was
Yeah.
asking,
Yeah.
Pride.
what you meant.
They both have some pride and self-esteem.
So the one thing you said that they have interesting histories. They have, the question then becomes, well, did anybody ask the others? Mm-hmm. This is an oral history project, not an ethnography of the moment. You sort of wonder about what Carter's life was before his eviction.
Or like what questions the interview thinks is going to be relevant to this person based on all kinds of things.
Yeah.
Right.
I actually, when I watched Cordell, my stereotypical image of a felon was challenged. He does not strike me like, I don't know. I wanted to go have coffee with Cordell. I really liked him. You liked Cordell? And so I was sort of surprised when he said he was a 3-time convicted felon, because I was like, oh, that's not what I would think about a felon. So it wasn't just about challenging the stereotypes of homelessness, but also of felon.
I also thought that, the righteous dope fiend is perhaps more the kind of stereotypical homeless imaginary, but at the same time, what I like about the text, it does challenge the sense of community that it presents us a negotiated kind of communal form of sociality that I think that in some ways does challenge what we imagine homelessness to be.
That's a good
Can
point.
you talk about that a little bit more? Because I feel like some of the conversations here are different than how I imagine homelessness. So I feel like we're talking about how these things are different than our stereotypes, but without saying what our stereotypes are. So I'd love to hear you talk more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that at least the cultural, I guess I'm imagining like a kind of cultural stereotype of the homeless person that's alone on the street,
Okay.
or
Disaffiliated.
or like in constant sort of like, if you have nothing, you're in constant competition for what is available. Or maybe there's like a really kind of small, like you work with one person, but it's this like take, but like we have this sort of imagination of just not a community that is negotiating with each other, that's taking care of each other, but it's not like working together. I mean, it's not,
I mean, like working
but yes and no, right? Like I think this is
it is.
also like, it also challenges a glorified version of a kind of liberal understanding of homelessness. Like, oh, people are just, you know,
Electing.
yeah, they're electing it, or you know, they have found ways to survive together. Like, it's not romanticized.
That's really important. Yeah. And they're not just victims; they're also victimized.
And so, maybe what I'm trying to say also is a one-dimensionality to our notions of homelessness, that all of the stories kind of challenge.
I always have in my head when we read this, there's always, not always, but so many intersections in Chicago. There is a homeless person, and that's his or her beat, and you never see anyone competing for it.
Yeah.
But it's like staked out territory. I mean, and they're always there.
Except for that one guy who went away for a while and then came back with one leg. When they're over at Ogden and Western. Yeah.
Did they do a story about him?
I just watched his wound grow and grow, and then he disappeared for a while and came back with one
Was
leg.
it diabetes?
He looked like one of our guys from Register. Sorry.
But you also see the tents, right? The camps and tents. And then you also in Chicago have the whole issue with the construction
Under the
and being displaced.
Yeah, so for me, my imagination is we have a tunnel right that I walk under, and it's it's very social. So for me,
that's
my
interesting.
Well, and
experiences
too,
are
like
very social.
the
That's why-
street medicine program at UIC, I mean, it is a connected network. Like
Yeah.
you can, like a lot of the homeless patients that we take care of that come through the hospital don't have phones, but one person has a cell phone.
Right.
And like, if you want to, like, there's this whole sort of relay system so that's kind of my current experience.
But this is intimate actual knowledge,
certainly-
not a wider
exactly.
stereotype.
Right, but this
Yeah.
is not my
That's important.
stereotype.
Yeah.
This is my like
lived experience.
lived experience,
And
as
medical
opposed
providers get
to
that.
But the issue that some of them are employed, so kind of blows my mind.
Yes, that's a big deal. They
Or
work.
entrepreneurial. I mean,
Work.
Cordell has his own business, right, in the summer?
Yeah.
That was just like, wow,
He's
that's
getting
cool.
into so how's he buying this to be able to sell it? You know, it's really interesting how he's figured out.
I can just see him like he doesn't explain it, but I would guess he like goes to the flea markets, right? Buy stuff super cheap, and then he says he spends a lot of time at the library and like I wonder if he's got like an eBay or something that he like marks them up and sells them like online for even I don't know. That's what I'm imagining, but I can't imagine. Obviously, I can't imagine him having a space to sell things, right? Because if he can use the space to sell things, then would he be homeless? Maybe, I don't know.
I do think this is one of the things that's been helpful for me in this is thinking about the middle area of homelessness. Like I think we often think of homeless folks at like the people who are on the corner who have their beat, who have disorders of thought and emotion, which is a term I just learned. Those kinds of things. Like that's what my image is. But I think this middle group of people who are precarious and who don't necessarily have no job, but who are in this like transient space, I think is a really interesting group. And they're the people who tend to be in public libraries and in ERs and things like that. When it's like, I've got it all handled, and then that one night hits, and I have to go to the ER because I'm freezing, you know, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's some echoes here, I feel like, of the domestic abuse issue as well if you want to talk about the female homeless population and that transientness and the like returning to some place that's not safe, but it's your only option. So I felt like there were some echoes here in some of their stories.
The gentrification, I think, is also a really important part of the story, because I do think housing crisis, if you look at where we are about comparison, 1 year ago, 2 years ago, very different, and we have the number of, it takes so long to housing. The person put into that can be great. Shelters are on streets themselves.
This is precisely the point that I was trying to draw out earlier when you said, well, that was just a bad choice. He didn't get a new house. He should have gotten a new one. But there was probably a time when the housing market was different, when it wouldn't actually have been crazy to think, I'm out of here, I can find something else. And that is historical structural change.
Well, and two, the differences per state. I mean, I have patients that leave Chicago because Section 8 is faster in Alabama or wherever else. Other states that they
Probably anywhere else.
yeah, maybe not like I mean
Not
New York or
New
something,
York,
but like
LA.
yeah. But like they will go to different states just because they know Section 8 is faster. Or if you're a senior, that there's just different ways to that.
I think that goes back to what we were talking about earlier about like how you use the system.
Yeah.
Well, and neither of them feel the same work. And I think, for those of us who listen to all the VA discourse, the VA services, and the hotlines and whatnot, it feels to me like it's working better than what they tell us happening. That movement to get people out into the private sector to get appointments faster was also something done, not like.
Yeah.
That was
That was
really
really
interesting to me.
I'm not sure people are aware of that.
So the VA has had a hard time recruiting enough care providers to be adult. And I'm most familiar with this when people have concussion and PTSD and they need to be seen and to get evaluations and stuff. So there was a big push to allow veterans to go to the private sector to get this care. And Durban actually was a big proponent of that. But the veterans have mixed feelings about it, I think. And the two men we heard from definitely did not think that was a thing. They still feel that it's an erosion of commitment.
Yeah, they didn't want to be referred out.
Right. I think they see it as an erosion of commitment.
Well, I also think that I think it was Cornell talks about the community that veterans get at the VA, because it's one of the only like exclusively veteran places that veterans can access. And he talks about, he kind of goes through like briefly kind of like what his medical problems are when she's asking like, what's your typical day like? And he says he goes to the VA probably 3 or 4 times a week to hang out. And I mean, you can see that across the street too, that, that bus stop on, is it Taylor and
Oh, that's the open air drug market outside the methadone.
sure, whatever. But they're all hanging out there, and they all like. I've seen people coming in on the train, like they'll put their hat on that says like Vietnam veteran or Gulf War, or to identify themselves as like this club in this community, which I think is really important too.
But it also the lessened commitment gets to the precarity definition, right? About how the public sector shrinks and the private sector expands, and the commitment by the federal government increasingly shrinks, and that is, I think it's to Butler, this very much indicative of this precarity moment.
Precarity is sort of an affective way of understanding a sort of individual subjectivity that goes along with what Schoenberg and Bourgeois call punitive neoliberalism.
Yes.
Right. Sort of a retraction of social service commitments and an expansion of the policing of the poor and Louis Poquon's stuff on neoliberalism. This is unique to this moment.
So going back to stigma, I also think we haven't talked enough about the and I think that they still are really hierarchy, or being part of the group, no mission-driven activity, and then you go out the private sector and your service part of knowledge is almost not relevant.
Yeah.
Whereas if you stay in the VA, you're going to have a different level of acceptance and understanding.
Allie, you were going to say something.
It might be tangential. I just find it interesting, and this is, I forget who in the roundtable was talking about the kind of the moment of whether we call it punitive neoliberalism or just sort of in general the austerity measures, that it's people that occupy some place of privilege that are leveraging the critique at this moment. It's also really interesting that it's like when you said that sort of pushing against the privatization or the outsourcing, I found it really interesting. So I was like, because in most other sectors, it's sort of like privatization is just going to happen. Like it's happened, it's already happening, but that somehow their proximity to this sort of sense of like, I deserve respect allows them, however even precarious that position of privilege is, allows them to say like no to this larger push towards kind of the austerity privatization. Which is why I think precarity as a concept is so useful, because it allows us to think in such kind of like, what's the word for like not all the same? Like
Not monolithic.
like gradient on a kind of level of gradient and continuum in relationship to how precarity is felt. Like, and I think that's what all of the narratives also make clear. Like, Righteous Dopamine, that the folks in there are living in a level of precarity that I feel like Cordell and Dawn are sort of like, they're not quite there yet. And they're able to navigate a system to stay on, they're still very precarious. But it's different.
There's a sense in which if things collapse for Don or Cordell, they might be on the street, whereas Carter might be dead tomorrow, and is.
Yeah.
Something else that might be, like, I think about this a lot, is somebody who's a vet who's in recovery versus, and so there's the drug addict and this idea of social support and the need to have people to really, but I mean, we've had, addicts come in and say, when I leave you, I am booking it out of here, because if I walk down this block, someone's going to offer drugs for free. And this idea that, like thinking that like the immediate thing is like, here's a pass ad, give it to them, and then we've got another customer. And that idea of like that sense of belonging, if you are an addict and here's this group that no matter what kind of a group support it is, it's still, and if you, almost the sense of isolation, if you're trying to recover, you have to let go of all your ties, and the sense of them almost being a little bit more solitary on their own, because they couldn't even thinking like out inside the hospital that or inside, like if you go past any of these places where maybe you would get support as a veteran, you've got this other group of people that are still addicted, and so then you're exposing yourself to that, and
that's what happens with Carter.
Yeah.
He's in the residential recovery, right? And he
there
feels
was a piece,
supported, and all these really terrible things happen. Somebody dies in his family, and this and that. His car gets stolen, but he tells Jeff, I'm okay. I'm still okay. But once he graduates, boom, his support system is gone, and so he goes back to the corner, right, for that community,
So
and ends up dead.
in the conclusion, which I think was a possible
I love that conclusion.
Is it?
I love that conclusion.
It tells the story also of another guy who finally gets housed in an SRO and then essentially lays there naked, drinking and eating until he overdoses. And so
I think the complexities of veteran, user, addict, recover, I mean, it makes it a whole nother story for each and every place and trajectory.
Yeah, I will say one of the things that it's striking me around, we're going to talk about this more in the pedagogy stuff, but stigma is a word that is like, it's not my field. And so I'm very aware of the fact that when Sandy was talking about the stereotype that she went to was felon, not homeless, right? And I think that one of the things you're talking about here is addict, right? Like, and it's all of these things are so interwoven. We talk about homeless folks. We're not talking about their homelessness. We're talking about all these things that are intersectional identities, because I think it's very rare that we're only ever talking about one piece of what they are. It's not the fact that they don't have a house, ever really. I mean, it is, but that is really not that's what makes them visible, but that's not what makes them stigmatized. And I think that's a really interesting piece about homelessness that I feel like is different from a lot of the other things that we stigmatize. Because I'll just leave it there. But I think that's a really interesting piece of homelessness. And part of what makes us, afraid of homeless people and all of this other stuff, it's not that they're not in a house. It's that we associate them not being in a house with
why
all these other things.
Must be
What if
something wrong
there's
with you.
moral problems? There's all these other things that we associate, and those are the things that we do, and that we assume have made them have this stigmatized identity.
But that gets back to the first theme, which is sort of structural vulnerability versus right? In that the stigmatized, you're right, I think that's a great point. The stigmatized identity is really about the structural causes. Right? Some of them, not all of them, but some of them are what are the structural causes that brought them to become homeless, right? Being a felon, being an addict.
But that's just it, right? Those are things that, in common parlance, don't feel structural to people. They are, and we think of them that way.
Right.
But that's why it's an individual spoiled identity, right? Not like
Spoiled identity. Exactly, and I do think that that's a piece that don't highlight enough when we're talking about homeless folks. Is that the piece that we're worried about is not the homeless, it's the other piece that's spoiled.
Yeah, in the early 80s, everyone thought of the homeless as the mentally ill, and it was deinstitutionalization. The numbers just didn't support it. It was a very small percentage of people on the streets were from psychiatric institutions. That's what everybody thought about.
Right, and so that's the piece in the history that would be really interesting to tease out, because I don't know that as a non-historian. I don't know those kinds of things. So that's the historical framework that I can't provide that I would love to use better in this kind of session, is the fact that
The war on drugs.
all this
flesh out
stuff is
that
stuff I can't speak to. And so I think that, especially like the old history, I think is kind of interesting, but to me, the more recent history is what really matters for this discussion. But I'm getting into the question. Sorry, I'll wait.
So let's take a what?
Well,
do we have 10 minutes or?
Do you want to wrap it, or do you want to talk about these last two questions?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, let's do that.
So either way, it's fine.
No, let's do that. Let's wrap it up. Yeah. I'm sorry. I wasn't.
I did.
My
It was so
teaching.
my fault.
We got this.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
I was doing great,
but
and
that,
then
like, our concluding discussion question, the first one is asking about, like, the historical structural forces. So thinking about those different periods, right, like the 80s and the 90s versus the early 2000s versus current, like, wrapping up, sort of bringing together what we've talked about, like how have the past forces really influenced the more recent past, right? So like the 80s influencing current day practice. And this might be, something we need to flesh out a little bit more in our beginning.
So I'd like to go back to the and culture's sense of obligation. So, another story that we didn't talk about was the woman who had and was sent out with her predate. Homeless woman.
Oh yeah,
Tina.
And
Righteous Dopamine.
so you think about again where you've got people touching lives at different points, and what is the moral obligation by to being, or is there just something else? And has that changed over? Because I think when you also talk about the intersectional identity, the Michael's comment about, the distancing because we don't want to think about it, I think that if we can blame them for their predicament, then we don't have to connect. But then we feel like something is asked of us, that we have an obligation to do something. And I am curious whether we have seen a shift over time in that. I mean, you look at polar vortex and the fact that you actually did see some activation to get people into hotels, and there were some public efforts. But where are we?
This is the resurrection of charity. We talked about this. This is the total divestment of any sort of structural response. And so a news media that is so quick to take up, look how great, great the individual response or sort of like that itself too, I think is, yes, it is both a difference, but I think it's still tied to a larger structural divestment of social supports, and then this rise of
It also
GoFundMe and
it also puts an enormous emotional burden on the individual medical provider. So of course the medical student says we want to help this. The right answer there is yes, we're obligated to this person. We have to take care of them. But they're facing circumstances where that just feels bad because there aren't the resources to connect them to, and they're not trained to do it.
And then they're given wellness programs and resilience programs, right? I mean, it's crazy. It's not the thing that's actually the problem.
Right.
It's the big structural problem.
But also the choice to help.
Right? Let's bring some history tonight.
The choice to help lies with the people who are privileged, right? So it's kind of like with the charity and
you mean in the current day,
right? So like in this situation, it's the moral obligation. So people can then feel good because they're helping, they're doing something. But you can only make that choice if you have that privilege to make that choice. Whereas like the people who are homeless, living in tents during a polar vortex, are sort of at the will of like the privileged person who has a moral compass or whatever, and so it creates like a really interesting social, I don't know,
But also
dynamic. And so it does, so it's like people can feel good about doing something good
in a crisis
and ignore the things that they really should, like policy change and advocating for things like that, because they're kind of paying attention to like passing out blankets.
And to figure out how you have the conversation with the person who's in need of assistance about what are the terms of assistance. That way make it palatable to them, because it seems like a lot of the messaging is you're making me live under your terms. I have to show up at a certain time. I have to follow the rule, and being able to say we've got some flexibility in terms of how we meet where you are and how we try to help you on a path that works for you. One size doesn't have to fit all.
Because some people want to stay in.
Well, so
some of that, and so for me to say like you have to find that
part
shelter.
of the story from the tents were that people are so afraid of their belongings being stolen if they go into a shelter. So the hotel option actually worked. If they had their own space, their own room, then they were appreciative. But being forced to only go into a shelter is not acceptable.
It's dangerous.
Yeah.
Very dangerous.
Right.
If you're
Exactly. Right.
Or if you're a man with a sexual
And people like those communities, people rely on their network, right? Like their whoever. Anyway.
But I think the
It's
point is
interesting.
not to be able to teach a story like this where you're not distancing and othering them.
Yeah.
You're figuring out how can you use them, as member of the human race.
Yes.
That we need
Right.
to figure out.
So
But that gets to your question, or your second discussion question.
yeah. Where'd you go?
Like imagining as a future physician, how can you best assess and account for? So kind of like Chrissy's saying, like not impose your beliefs and your mindset of how.
And so I do think that, part of what happens with students and residents and whatnot is they feel so overwhelmed by it. They feel like, call this a but, just simply hearing their story and hearing what options they see and helping to expand potential options to see if something can be negotiated is something that every care provider.
Just try not to hate. I mean, as
yeah.
as an intern, I'm trying to imagine taking care of Carter and Petey
Yeah.
and how difficult they would have made my life, which is
Difficult
completely insane.
population.
Different patients.
Well, but patients are different too, because well, I mean, I don't know. Like in my experience too, there are some that are very befriending too. I've had that experience too, where like you get emotionally invested with the patient and connected and you want to do it.
Likability does not equate to social worth.
Yeah.
Right, but
Which is-
there's interesting dynamics there too, and then certainly patients who bring the lie about being a veteran or something, and how that like can emotionally activate people.
And then,
I don't know.
and then
it's
if you find out
interesting.
someone wasn't telling the full truth, feeling
And
very
then-
betrayed and rejecting.
Yeah.
Christy, though, I think that what you're talking about is shared decision making, basically.
Yeah.
And I think that's good practice for clinicians for any patient.
Yeah.
Not just for
It can be
homeless.
But I think it's more than that. I think she's talking about more than that. I think she's talking about being, recognizing that people, like, not just like listening to people, but really like the way I'm thinking of this with the street medicine program. And I remember having a really good conversation with Suki Bain about this, who has been involved. And we had a whole conversation about that program, which was great. They've been debating, because right now the way that the program works, they go to a certain spot and then the homeless folks have to come to them. And that's a problem, for the exact reason that Christy is talking about, is that not everybody's willing to go to the place that the people who are doing the street medicine will go to. Well, so they go, they're on the
but
street.
it's a van,
still.
and
It's
so
a van,
it's like
whatever, so that's where
usually
they
try
have their
to
stuff.
somewhere.
Right, so they have to go somewhere, but not everybody's able to come. Not everybody's able to schlep there. And so there's been a whole debate about how to make it even better, meeting them where they are, right? And so that's what I'm hearing. At least I don't want to speak for you, but I'm hearing it as even more than just like meeting them where they are mentally, but like also recognizing their physical and emotional and all of the other needs I have, and recognizing that like we can't just impose our structural needs necessarily, but also
There's the story also in Righteous Dystopian that I don't know if it's included, of the medical resident basically prescribing Hank high-dose morphine to keep him coming back for his chemo. It's fascinating.
Creative medicine.
And I think
I mean, there's something to that.
Which
Yes.
is also
There is
very,
something to that.
very
Yeah, absolutely.
specific to the 2000s, like, or the 90s and the 2000s. Like, I'm sure that would not happen today. Right? Like,
Right.
Interestingly, because of the opiate epidemic,
Right.
this resident was able to do
Yeah.
basically morphine maintenance.
Correct.
yeah.
Without drawing attention.
That's
Right.
Allie's book.
Chapter.
there's another possible approach to the creative medicine idea of, in addition to listening, having suggestions based on people's actual experiences. So if you are treating someone who's living on the streets for some sort of open wound and you tell them to keep it clean,
Okay.
how do you do that? And also everything that you've been taught is like wash it. And so if you only have access to dirty water, you can potentially be making it worse. So if you are not just listening, but asking the right questions and having additional knowledge that like is
About
within
the
medical-
conditions.
Yeah, within the
Right.
medical field
Right.
to say, okay, if you have access to this, here's what you can do. If you don't, here's an
And where would
alternative.
you get that information? Where do you think you would find that? From the other patients.
Well, that's right.
Yeah. So,
And you gotta
hey,
ask
my other homeless
cultural
patients who struggle with this do this.
I call
But
it
you won't know that
experiential
unless you ask them.
expertise.
How do you manage?
But and then I think the next step of that
I
though,
just wrote an
is
abstract.
and just putting that within medical knowledge, right? To say like, if you're telling someone to keep something clean, here's what that means in different situations, right?
But that's why they have to ask.
Yeah.
But that gets to Jody's stuff with the curiosity. Like if I'm prescribing something, like, yeah,
I'm sorry,
anyway.
guys. Can we do one?
Sorry.
It doesn't have to be this one.
Yeah,
I just,
this is
Okay.
This is a sideline.
Okay.
Should we take a break?
Yeah.
Otherwise, I think we could go on.
everything, because I know the thing went on.
So let's take like a 5-minute break, because we're already at 4, and I think it would be good to have an hour, like a good, I don't know, 55 minutes of conversation.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Be done at 5, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, just take a quick break. Go to the bathroom, come back like 5:05.
Okay, you should. So it's based on a true story. Yes, and so he, I think in this story he's a Vietnam vet, and it's based off a true story out of Portland. There was this man who had a 12-year-old daughter. His wife had died. He was a Vietnam vet.
Coming in at bad PTSD,
Could not function in, like, he just needed to live in nature and could not function in society. And so basically took his daughter and moved and lived in like a forest resort outside of Portland. And he was found. They had been living there for like 4 years when they were discovered by like a runner. And so obviously they were then, especially because he had like a 12-year-old daughter who was like, they had an encyclopedia, like it's wild. And so he was kind of like forced into a home situation because his daughter is in school, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so that was the article. They were placed into a home living situation and then disappeared. And that's like where the true story ends, but the movie then kind of builds on what happened with the daughter and the father. And it's just fascinating. And the scenes are really good, like of him in the Portland VA, because he goes once a week. He goes to the VA to get his meds.
But that's what
And then he sells
thinking.
them, and then he goes and buys things, and then he goes back into the world. But like the scenes are so. I mean, I've never been to the Portland VA, but I've been to many other places.
They're very
So
what's it as I try not to be defensive, and I know that the VA is highly valuable, but I've been in like 3. Do you see? Have you been in multiple VAs over the years?
Indiana, Hines, and Jeff Brown.
Oh, okay. Because the Danville VA.
My grandfather used to go to one, but it was like a small clinic in a rural area. You know how they have in rural areas kind of thing.
Yeah, my grandfather used to go to Cleveland VA. It was not
like a. Well, but like both my grandfathers had private insurance and VA insurance, so both my grandfathers only ever went to the VA for meds.
Yeah.
And then they would go to other places.
Yeah.
But they were both very proud that they could go elsewhere.
Yeah.
And they only use the VA for their meds.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's what it's like for people that have like public-private systems, like health systems.
Yeah, I don't know.
If there's like things that, you know, they're like, oh, I wouldn't trust public for this, so I'm gonna go private. Like surgery, like vascular surgery, or like elective procedures or fertility treatments or something like that, versus like, oh, I'm gonna go to the public because like I can get my insulin for free if I go to the public hospital or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I felt like that one. Let me revisit the material. I felt like that one. I felt like that one. I didn't get it in very far in advance last time, but I felt like it would be okay for the following one. But let me look at it again.
Oh, you run it. If you think it's good, then that's we were talking the facilitators
Sure.
did, and we can just.
When I was in nursing
Sure,
school,
that's fine.
I was a tech at a palliative care unit.
Oh, interesting. So that's the other really interesting thing about the VA, at least at Hines, is because we had like the extended care center.
Oh yeah.
And so for a lot of men at the end of life, most hospice and nursing home facilities are like open, but for a lot of veteran men, it was like profoundly helpful to be like, and when you're in that stage where you're weak and you can't help yourself, to be surrounded by other vets, male vets. Like it was just like a really intense sense of identity that like,
That's important. Yeah, there was a palliative care unit at the West Haven VA that I didn't get to rotate on, but that makes a lot of sense.
Oh, I don't know. I don't think
You can get any like virtual. I feel like the hard part's over. I feel like the hard part's over now.
I do sometimes. I think.
You could do that. Like, could you keep your job and do that?
They don't want
I
it.
offered, yeah.
Thank you for doing all the work.
What they're trying to do is actually get them much, but while I'm still there. So I'm trying now.
Oh, it's not ready. No, it's ready to break.
Russia's HR just do the job for people, so it's definitely not. But they also they like don't understand non-medical positions, and they like don't know what to look for, and
Oh, there you go. Now I have to link like that. Now
Okay.
Like, it's too complicated. I just want my French press.
I know, right?
Yeah.
They're trying
I got-
for
One of their words, for sure.
I think we got
It's
it.
working.
They took them
I do pour over.
I do pour over my office.
Yeah.
and they've like kind
You
of
like a French
explicitly
press?
said at points.
It depends on the coffee.
Or, yeah, right?
My
Where do you get
favorite
your
is
coffee?
actually espresso. Well, how do you make that?
They also
I have a, like a sort of espresso machine. When I got the job, I was like treating myself. I was like,
See?
If I go out, I
Almost
order an
done
espresso or like that's
See,
what I
I
like.
used to accept at La Colombe where I always get a drink.
Oh, really? That's really close to you, right? Isn't that?
They have a
Nah,
direct
it's in
connection.
Oregon,
I
but
like
yeah,
that.
it's close.
I
I
just
love
really
that
miss
one.
I think there's one on like Arlington.
They also have,
It's just not listed on Friday, so
like,
I mean, on Friday, but
I cold brew on tap,
and
which I really like.
I don't like cold coffee.
Oh,
I
really?
mean, I lived in
I
Utah
actually need to get into
I just like
9
all
years,
day.
and I have
I like.
I have to
don't like
limit
cold
myself.
coffee,
It's like
under
trying to
one
drink
person.
more tea.
That,
Multicultural type centers. So my
what did you
goal is to be there enough until they're like, oh, we have more money for this.
my husband and I though, like his like aunt and uncle, they like when we like visit family and stuff, we like
I was trying to
like powder and just
Wow.
we always like have to make a plan for like
That's why I just say tea. Like I just do it.
right?
That's why like unless it's made by like because I'm really picky. I don't like drip coffee because I
Oh, really?
well, if I get drip coffee, I add like a ton of cream and sugar,
Yeah,
and it's
no.
just like, and then I still don't like it.
Yeah.
So I like
Yeah, this is
like lattes
Yeah.
without
This is
sugar
like
in it because it's got enough milk in it. Like
Oh,
it's
got it,
like
yeah.
sweet enough to cover up the
Yeah.
bitterness enough. So I'm just like tea.
We got my brother. This is like the best present to get when you have a baby. But like when my first daughter was born, my brother sent us a burr grinder, like a burr grinder. So it's like
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
yeah. And seriously, the coffee tastes so much better with a burr grinder instead of like what we were using before.
Yeah, I mean, we have like a, I don't know, like bird grinder. I don't know, like a nice coffee, like a fresh ground
Yeah.
and then put it
I
in
think
the,
once we.
So one has like
schedule these
spikes and
regular
just like
meetings,
kind of
we
shreds
start-
them, and the burr grinder uniformly
Because I
grinds
have no
it.
memories. And I think we need to
Anyway,
No, I thought
whatever.
it was something, though.
It's silly that I know about all this.
sounds like it was survival for you.
But my parents are funny because they just like inhale coffee. They don't even taste it.
I feel like.
I like actually enjoy the taste of it.
He has a better.
My dad is coffee fanatic. My brother hates it. My mom doesn't drink it, and I'm kind of like,
I see it when I see my partner.
Yeah.
'Cause he drinks it.
Okay.
We'll go get coffee in the morning or whatever.
Yeah. But like he has it like coffee every day.
I can believe
Does he make it? Or
Yeah.
yeah, okay. Yeah.
And he likes it iced.
Oh,
So
interesting.
he makes
Even in the
pictures of
winter.
it.
Oh, got it. Okay.
He
So then he
takes,
can
like,
just pour it.
2 of these to work.
Full of iced coffee.
Right.
You know, but
And that'll
And
last
he
an 8 and a
sleeps
half.
fine.
Yeah.
And I just, Mom was like,
I don't know what to say to that.
I know, right? That's like my mom. Like
Right, that's what
I tried to get it.
I like have cutoffs and I don't drink any caffeine after like noon, and my mom will drink like 2 venti coffees.
I'm kind of glad
It's not really the thing.
It's wild.
I don't know. It doesn't.
Yeah, and then I'm not like,
cholesterol or do that, you know,
I'm a little neurotic. I would be.
the innovation report is all laid out in America. If you go to
But this way,
academic medicine, they give
I
you
have
all
to
these-
show you what I'm working on. So we can read an article in a sweater class. So excited.
I don't actually make it.
I was trying to
I
find
know, right?
example articles.
That's
before I
pretty.
text
Right?
you,
I like
and I
it.
couldn't
It's
find
gonna be perfect
anything.
for
I
May.
don't have it listed on
But really, I'll
mine.
finish this in the fall.
I like it.
Isn't it amazing? So, well, I'm doing the class because it's like
Hey, Sandy,
but like you can do all
do
these
you know what
different
12 stars first book was?
options, like different.
Can you show me
Anyway,
in a second?
whatever.
Very pretty. I like it.
You bought
Right?
it and
Yeah.
I'm excited.
You'll be fine.
nervous
You'll be-
that we're
I
not.
forgot.
Nikki's
What are you doing?
She's not.
Shawls. You always do like
saying,
shawls.
it strangled my faculty.
and afraid that it's not.
You know, like
It's very
This has
easy
these
to
fun
hack.
Oh, no, this.
Like, we have
Oh,
to dive
You're making a
deeper.
sweater?
Yeah.
Wow.
I like it.
It's gonna take forever.
Yeah.
I
Is
thought-
this like one part of it, or is it?
Folks that are
This is the
interested
top.
in
Yeah.
how much I experience it.
So this is like the,
Wow.
just like,
Yeah.
well, it's all around, but like this is where my
It's from
head
like
goes.
the late
Really
70s.
good.
And this is the shoulder.
Kind of raising
It's gonna take forever.
You know, and so.
No, it's also a sewing pattern.
And I think what's
You know, but
really
it's just all the, so there's like different versions of the sweater. And then these are all like the instructions.
But that's what it's how to knit.
she went on a quick Google.
Very well.
Kind of, but it's also like photos of like the sewing pattern too, and then like we use the sewing pattern.
It's like, you know, we get those.
Okay.
Anyway, so it's like, it's way longer. The actual pattern is probably like 3 pages.
We're gonna start. We're gonna start because also Shay reminded me that to do the poll at the end, I'm sorry, the survey at the end, we need about probably 10 minutes. So we're gonna shave 10 minutes off. I'm going to my office further. Okay, so I am leading the pedagogical part of this, and you know, I guess the first question that every pedagogical part is starting with, although you know each team can decide on their own. But did you find this portrait to be cohesive? How can we make it more cohesive? And what changes do you think we should, you know, what adjustments do you think we should be making to make this work?
When you list it, is it by order of how people should read? Because I always, it is, I mean.
Oh, no, I
No,
agree
we
with
did
your
not
question.
do that, and we should have.
We
Because
should.
I really feel like that's how
It was a little
usually when we're
confusing.
creating
Yeah.
this, we're
That's
picturing
important.
that, but I think,
What order do you
you know.
think we should read it in?
oh, good.
The videos first.
Yeah, the first person narratives always come first.
So okay, I have to ask another question. I'm confused. The clips that we were supposed to, I'm confused with, is you watching the clips in the session itself, and then we're reading the entire 2 transcripts?
Agreed.
I'm
There's
really
confusion.
confused.
The idea was assign a limited number of clips,
Great.
assign the transcripts, assign the righteous dopamine and the other stuff, and then use some of the clips that presumably everyone watched to move things along.
to tee
Okay.
things up in the session.
Because I know the student feedback was like, if it's a transcript, can you do so? And I understand a lot of it is we're talking about literature and stuff, but like this ability to watch some and not have to read everything because they're having to read and consume so much.
So that was with
and then-
Gretchen's. So should we just get rid of the transcript? Are the clips enough, or do you think that?
I like
clips
having the transcript because I prefer to read.
It became much more clear when I had the whole thing because some of them were starting in the middle and I was like, where am I supposed to
So
read?
you do want to have it?
What is the really?
But
So
maybe say you can do either or.
Or what about making the transcripts available during the session?
Oh.
So there's a lot of content that's subtle. They would actually benefit from dedicated reading.
And also that would be disability.
What would?
Yeah,
If
you would
people
want
need
to have
extra
them.
time or they needed.
Oh, for reading. Or just
Yeah, I
like,
think
We've
you
been
want.
doing that though constantly, right? That has been a strategy.
But you could, why wouldn't you just say you can, here are the videos and also the transcripts at the same time, ahead of time? You could, and you
Which is
you
what we
could
did.
do what Anne Maria was saying. You could say you could do either or.
The only
I found
problem
that
is
just-
that the videos are not all inclusive.
The videos are very brief.
You know, I did not read the transcript and I felt like.
But you watched all the videos, not just the assigned ones, but
But
the whole
actually,
pamphlet.
I would probably prefer to do that. Watch the whole videos and not read the transcript.
Okay.
and some med students might.
I thought
They
they
can
were
get
doing
different
something.
things from different.
Like I wanted to press play, like
Just watch the whole
just watch the whole thing.
Yeah.
It
Well,
was like,
so that would be.
Have
the
it-
how
have
long
it-
is it?
thing. No,
How
they
long
were
is the whole video?
They're not.
For both of them?
They're not
Are
available.
they all like?
I don't think it's available.
Okay. Because
So
I
I-
would prefer that myself.
And I thought we were supposed to read the clips, not watch them. So I was reading it, and so I think if you assign watching the clips and then have the full transcript and let them know, because there are going to be students like that that are going to be like, what the hell, or frustrated or whatever, and they're going to want to be able to, you know, that these are
But it's
pieces
just
of.
worth 1,000 words.
Yeah.
I mean, I
Yeah,
think,
but I think
what I-
available to people maybe.
what I've done in my classes when I've had to put things in multiple format, it's just packaging, like how you present it, like sort of say like, this is the videos, watch the videos, and then just say alternative means of engaging with the material, excerpted transcript, alternative means, full transcript, like just as a way that adds a little bit of clarity that like it's all the same thing, however you want to kind of like market it.
So one of the things, what we struggled with was there were a lot of clips that weren't relevant or useful. Yeah. And there was a lot of information in the full transcript, not the ones that originally went out, that wasn't in any of the clips, like Don's suicide attempts and the fact that Cordell wanted to kill his daughter. It's just not there. So we just weren't sure.
Right. So I think what people are suggesting is
it's a lot though. I mean, I would
Is
just
it?
I would yeah. I don't know.
It's not.
Laura felt real overwhelmed. I'm just gonna say that from a third person perspective. It was a lot.
So
and
what
I
if we-
love transcripts.
So what if we said the expectation is that you read the transcripts. If you can't read the transcripts, here are some clips that cover maybe 75% of what's in the transcript. And then when we're doing the discussion, we'll still have the clips in there to really give kind of like voice and face to the transcripts during the discussion.
Before we get to that point, can I just ask, how long did it take people to read the draft?
I couldn't even get to it's when I read and when I saw the required reading, I was like, holy shit. And I am not a medical student.
So when I think about what students are going to be willing to engage with, I think it was
too much.
Too much. Okay. And I would prefer to get it down to an hour of prep material for the session, and then have a lot of supplementary material.
And just so we're clear, we're only talking about the required readings, not like all the additional stuff.
So here's the question: was the butler and that stuff required for medical students?
Theoretically.
Yeah.
Wait,
Okay.
which one
So
was the
that,
butler?
by the way,
The
in
round
and
table,
of
the
itself,
comparative
the round
table.
table.
No, not that. It's not the whole round table.
got
It's
it.
2
Okay.
pages of the round table.
Yeah.
That's
Look at the required reading.
It's very
Did you
Yeah.
guys read it? It's
Okay.
pages 165 to 166 and
That's okay.
169 to 170. You didn't read the
I didn't
reading
look-
list.
I was
So it was just
Oh God,
unclear
no.
because
No.
Yeah.
We
I mean,
read the
I read it,
round
but-
table. Nobody could
No.
understand that.
No.
It's 2
There's like
pages.
2 pages.
Yeah, so
That
I
wasn't
would
clear.
recommend
Well, wait a minute.
when we
How is that
actually
not clear?
give
Then
that,
you have to
so
read
on
it.
the list.
You have to go
yes,
by the reading
I
list.
get that.
Yeah.
But just heads up, when
Did you
when
read the
normal
syllabus?
normal humans do this kind of work, what they do is they're really overwhelmed with life, and medical students are too. They click on box and they open box
That's
and
what I
they
did.
read
Okay.
what's in box. They
So then-
don't read what the pages are. They need it.
Okay. So then what we
Right.
could do theoretically, I mean, so
Like create a
is-
separate document.
make a new document of
Have
the
the
relevant
title
pages.
page and then just the pages that you
Yeah,
need.
or like
and the
strike
reference
through
list
the
at the
other
end
stuff.
and be done.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So I know that
and you
sounds
could even
ridiculous,
No,
but
that's
that
fine,
is an
that's
actual
fine,
thing that
that's
needs to
Okay,
happen.
so
But you could even number them and say like reading 2, reading 3, reading 4, how many pages it is, and then like link to that.
that was supposed to happen. I guess that was a mistake, and that's partly my fault. I usually go through and see what's in the folder before it goes out, but I also am overwhelmed, so I didn't have time.
No, I mean, I
But
think
yes,
that's a pretty common
absolutely.
thing
When
around
we
here.
gave the reading list to be compiled, it was just supposed to be the page numbers that we gave.
Well, and it was the other one, the Bourgeois. Is that how you say it?
Bourgeois.
Is it bourgeois? Bourgeois.
That was excerpt.
That was excerpted, and that was easy because
Except
it was.
that one of them was just a random page.
Except that one of
Sorry
them was
about that.
just a random page. But yes, the rest of it, that made it easy because you could figure out what to read.
So yeah, okay.
So you were
Still
not
felt like
supposed
a
to
lot.
read that entire thing.
So
because
without
it's
the round
totally
table,
not
is it still overwhelming?
accessible except to Allie.
Good. I was gonna say, like, for med students, I'm like, oh,
Yeah, no.
I'm not saying I didn't enjoy
No, but
skimming
no,
it.
I
It's
get it.
just 2 pages. Just 2
But,
pages.
but 2 pages in, because I will admit, I was like, oh, I'm so excited to read the roundtable. I didn't like to go back and reread it, that I didn't realize that we were only excerpting it. And then I got about like 1.5 pages in, and I was like, I'm pretty sure we're not meant to read this whole thing.
Yeah.
And then when I saw the highlighted, and then I went back and looked at the reading list, but
I read the highlights and I was like, that's really helpful.
I know. So I think
It
I
was
was
highlighted.
really
Thank you,
excited to
Sandy.
see the roundtable again.
Thank you, Sandy.
Okay. I understand. Okay,
yeah.
well, we can make that clearer. Yeah.
I don't know, but I mean, we're talking about the amount of readings. I don't know if you want to talk about this here, but I found the point about challenge that Allie made about challenging accessing the system. part of that understanding of med students, I feel like, is they don't know anything about systems. And so one of the attitudes may be like, just go sign up for the vet benefits. You're a vet, go get what you're entitled to and shut up. You know, or like whatever, they don't understand the complexities of the system, especially as med students, until they're in practice and involved in the system. And so I'm not saying to add to the reading, but I felt like it was, so that was one point I really wanted to make, that they have to understand, part of that sensitivity is understanding what somebody goes through when they navigate the system. So I felt like they're a piece of that, understanding how, not only how somebody, you know, how that system is, what the limits are of that.
It took me a long time to realize that not everyone who served in the military is eligible for VA benefits.
There's so many nuances that I don't know how to really, but I feel like that is part of that awareness that we're trying to build in med school systems that might.
But even just putting it in the PowerPoint.
Yeah, or creating like a timeline, or like when I teach this on disability policy, I do like a timeline, and then I do like a statistic, like X number of people that apply for disability benefits gets rejected, and then I sort of take them through, or like, here's the timeline, you apply, and then a year later maybe you get it, and then just like having that does so much work for this, like visually, to complicate the you apply for benefits, you get that.
So do you mean a timeline as a assigned reading, like appendix,
like something,
or
in
the teaching session?
In the teaching session, like in the PowerPoint, like maybe it's not a timeline. I don't know VA benefits, but like if I were to do this around disability benefits, like literally just creating a timeline. You apply, you get rejected, you reapply, wait 60 days, like, and having that marker just so they can visually see like this is not a clear-cut process.
And even like something like just because you get benefits doesn't mean it actually covers. And I know those are so nuanced and it's very difficult to be comprehensive with that, but I just think some of these. The other thing I felt like was important, the historical piece. Like I really liked what you did historically, but I feel like one, I wasn't really clear when these transcripts, like the date was on 2016. I weren't really sure what, like where
we need to
these folks were
contextualize
situated.
Yeah,
and I
we
feel
jumped
like
right in.
and I feel like there's, especially like the young med students know nothing about the historical context of the war and all that stuff, but there's also this chunk of all the, you know, of where we are now with shelter, like more of the contemporary aspect that I feel like
this is what
if
Sandy
it's too
argued for.
historical, they're not, you know, so, and I know I'm,
No,
this
was a discussion we had.
Yeah.
And I argued against like
I
liked
that, but I felt like there's this chunk of more contemporary.
I don't think they need to go back to the beginning.
Yeah.
Not because
and
it's not
also,
interesting.
That this speaks to the way end of this section. I don't know if we'll have time, but Lily found a really good image. Well, we're not sure it's a really good image. It's a propagandistic image, but it does have some good data, I'd say.
Well,
can you bring it up? Do you know what I'm talking about?
So in the email that went out with the materials in the recommended readings, there's the image. So, but let me just, can we just, in terms of the readings, all right? If it were video or transcripts, selections from Dope Fiend, is the right necessary?
So can I ask a question before we get there? Are we assuming that the Dope Fiend is a first-person narrative or no?
No.
So I found that the way that we were talking about it today to be problematic then.
That's true.
Because I felt like we were talking about it as a first-person narrative, and it's not. So to me, that, like, because I literally just went back to the reading list because I was like, shit, I didn't read it, apparently, because I read that, but I didn't view it as a first-person narrative. And so I've been very confused the whole time because they weren't people to me in the same way, because I was reading it much more from a perspective of ethnography and analytic. I read it from the perspective of what I thought was the analysis and less from the perspective of trying to get the narrative.
Well, are those mutually exclusive?
No, but I think that we didn't use the analysis piece of that.
Enough.
Okay. Not enough. Just we didn't do that. So if I were to write this as a portrait, I would argue that it's reasonable to put that as a first-person narrative, or at least to treat that as the narrative, because it's at least, or to take it out, because I think right now we did something wonky with it. I
It
feel
is
so
it is not, I mean, it is very crafted.
I know, so that made me uncomfortable. As an ethnographer, it made me uncomfortable. I'll just lay that there. I found the whole thing uncomfortable.
Discomfort isn't bad.
No, I know, but I felt uncomfortable with how we treat it. So, because I felt like we were using it as if we were talking about these people from their perspectives, and we weren't. And so.
No, we were right. We were
And
talking
so-
about it from
And we went back and forth.
researchers.
Yeah, we went
Right.
back and forth between it, and I didn't.
Do you think that drawing that point out along the way do you think that acknowledging that along the way would be enough to say, like, no, listen, look at what we're doing here?
Or you have that meta moment, right?
Yeah.
I think that would work for me.
Because it's really
It's
rich.
very rich.
It's
And I
devastating
think to talk
entirely.
about it, you know, to again contextualize the ethnography is how we read that. This is why we're, but I think that would work.
I know,
And
I think
it's,
find out. Like I just find that there's a lot that's been written about critiques of how people do these kinds of
Oh, it
ethnographies.
is.
Of
It
course.
is brilliant.
I'm sure it's great.
It's the best of the genre.
It is absolutely brilliant. I read the whole book.
And I think that they packed a lot of really good material.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the other thing is, I'm sorry.
It's brilliant.
And
And
they
here's where
also-
maybe the conclusion actually, Matthew,
Yeah, yeah.
instead of the pages we gave, maybe the conclusion is better because it's more analytic. It's way more analytic.
It is. It's long. You
It
know?
is long.
I think the piece that we
reads
didn't
pretty
include,
I thought.
the piece
What'd
that we
you say?
didn't include here, the piece that we didn't include here that I think was the stand-in for the sort of single random page was something about like a few paragraphs or a few pages about the political offensive against the homeless, where it had to do with sort of clearing the camps and how people were living and sort of giving some context to that. I just don't know. I mean, we can't include much. I mean, and what we don't want to do is just include stuff from Dope Fiend that is field notes that makes it look like only first-person experience.
Right, 100%.
Yeah.
And I appreciate
Because
that.
those parts do really look, they pretend they are first person. And it only, in the context of the wider analysis, it's fine, but if those are the excerpts we're using,
I agree.
it's problematic.
That I agree with. I
Yeah.
just, and maybe the fix is to make sure we're really clear at the beginning of the session how we talk about it.
Wow.
It just made me uncomfortable
Yeah.
throughout.
So I have another question. Maybe should we get rid of one of the flip people, Cordell or Dawn, and to give more room for the righteous Dope
That
Fiend?
would actually be okay with me
Or we could give people the option of one.
because they were in many ways very similar. Their stories were very similar.
How do other people?
We seem to talk more about Cordell.
I think Don is the more atypical, which I like that. The
Yeah, I
breaking
don't know.
stereotypes. It's a little bit more like that.
Depends on what you're looking at. What we want.
Yeah, I mean, I think, what do we want them to leave with? Because I think some of these questions, we could get so mired in details,
Yeah.
right? And like, they should have this, they should have that,
Yeah.
and to the point where it's oversaturation and that's being full.
Right.
Yeah.
So we talked about that too.
Yeah.
And that's where the sort of articulation of the sub-themes I think is really important because originally we had like, I don't know, 20 sub-themes. We had like 10 or 20 sub-themes. It's just rich, you know, all these themes, all
We
these
marched-
social themes are really rich.
We marched
And
through a
you-
lot.
Huh?
We covered a lot. It was,
No.
and I'm just saying, yeah, it's pretty.
So we got it down to these three. And that's really what I think the focus should be.
Well, we
And
haven't,
even that's a lot. So maybe should get rid of one.
I mean, the right piece, we didn't, I'm wondering, like, in the overview that you provided, you went through a lot of what's in the right piece. So I wonder if we can move
So-
that to a recommended. I mean,
That's true.
there's like really important stuff in here.
So one of the things I was struggling with was how much to just tell people what was going on when homelessness became an issue in the 1980s versus having it emerge from the material. So, and that's why I could begin this right in 1980. and I could say, like, look, there was gentrification, there was the eradication of SROs, there was the contraction of the welfare
And
state.
they still
there was
think that's ancient history.
deinstitutionalization.
Right, they were even born
I
anyway.
could do that, right? But then,
And it's
but
a
then-
lecture.
yeah.
We don't want.
But then with that first question about the interaction of individual vulnerabilities and structural determinants, I mean, ideally, I think what we were thinking was at the end of this, we're able to sort of reflect back and be like, okay, well, let's think about these political economic forces and how they structured our understanding. But it didn't really.
Well, I think it's important for students to understand the histories of some things. Like a brief history of homelessness. I mean, it's not the full, that it is a recent term and such. I think it's important.
So, but maybe all of my slides could be one slide, and then one or two others on 1980 to 90 on the new homelessness.
I mean, that's a good critique because we talk about like periodization between like the 80s and 2000s and modern. So I think we need to provide that content, that political context, right? If we want to ask them what forces are shaping these different periods, like they have to know what they
More
were at
about
that time.
Yeah, and overall, I'm not like, I wasn't sure what year the
But, like, the
publication,
war on
like
drugs,
the
like-
timing of all these were, I was like,
Yeah, that can be very
when do these
confusing.
things fit in with each other?
So
Well,
the
too,
other,
if you always think there's homelessness in the way that there are now, right, then it's just the problem's always there.
Yeah.
Right? And there's been so many attempts to fix it, and
yeah,
you're never
that's a
going to
great
fix it.
point.
It's always been here. It's
Yeah.
always been this way.
Inevitable.
So the other thing, and this is sort of skipping a little bit in the pedagogical discussion, but under the activities, one of the suggested activities was that what happens if we use the right piece as a historical document? Because it's from 1989.
Yeah.
And it becomes a class activity where what happens when you start reading right as though you're reading right as sort of a published contemporaneous document.
And I really struggled with that possibility because I liked the article as,
Right.
yeah, I really struggled with that.
So
But it's a rich question.
that could be really cool as like the down. I mean, I would have you do that as like a later, like when you have like a week-long class. I feel like there's so much to unpack here first. I guess,
It's almost
is
like
what I'm-
it's almost like a historical methods thing.
Yeah, it
You
is
could
a
do it-
historical
You could do it
method.
later. I mean, sure, but I feel like there seems like lower hanging fruit.
There's a
I'd
lot to
say.
learn.
There's a lot here that I think, particularly for medical students,
Yeah.
that would be more exciting and more like immediate that I would have.
As an activity.
I mean, the activity is discussion, right? Like I think.
No,
there's
But we're thinking about having them
No, there's
draw a
also
homeless
like
person.
activities.
Yeah, but I mean, like, how long is this class supposed to be?
It's an hour and a half, right?
Right,
75
but
minutes.
are they going to need more than that? I mean,
I
is
think
it
that
going to really take them? I think they're going to have a lot to talk
Well,
about.
I think the purpose is so when we deposit this for others, like
If there's
they can
something there.
structure it as
How they want.
Like if they want to make it more of like a
Okay.
activity and just focus on one thing, or they can
Yeah.
do that
Yeah.
versus if they want to
Yeah.
have a full, discussion or whatever works for them.
I would personally vote against that. But,
You
yeah,
would, okay.
I like.
Did you guys put
I
that in
hate
here somewhere in your teaching guide? Or?
I don't think activities. I just think that particular
Oh,
activity feels
okay.
like
Oh,
too far away
okay.
from.
Are there other things? That
Oh,
we can
exercise, got
imagine?
it, okay.
Because the best, at its best, teaching really does incorporate all of the different, not just lecture, and even not just discussion. So but I struggled to think of other things.
I don't know. Even I know you were kind of joking about the sketching, but I like that idea of like under the viaduct community of camps. Like, you're reading that narrative of what that looks like and maybe sketching
Sketching what it is.
sketching
Kind of like
what you envisioned
aggression.
in your head of that community of tents with people and syringes and the whatever. I don't know. I just
Or at
might.
least even writing
I don't know if there's
Or
just
like
time
the
for
other
that,
thing I
but-
thought was interesting too was like the day in the life kind of thing. Like what is your day kind of thing? Like trying to imagine like you wake up in a tent, like what do you spend
That's
the hours doing?
Yeah.
Because it kind of echoes the narrative that we
Yeah.
heard.
Yeah.
Because I think that would be challenging for students to think like, oh, you just sit around. Or like, you know what I mean? Like, who knows what they're going to bring to that. But like when you actually talk to people that are homeless, like people have systems.
Yeah,
For,
you're
like,
yeah. It is
What
that-
time
We're
you
not
do.
giving them that
Yeah, we're not
material.
gonna.
Yeah.
So I don't
No,
want them-
but
No, but it is an
maybe
exercise.
they should maybe we should challenge them to think about it.
It might be.
I don't know.
That's interesting.
I don't know.
Them to
Speculate too
strengthen
much.
stereotypes.
Yeah, right. And
But then
assign
we,
them.
but that's okay because
But
that's
we
part
need
of
to
the
have
drawing out
deconstruct them.
We
assumptions.
need to have first-person material for them to challenge it.
Yeah, right. No,
So
I agree.
I
So that could be
Well,
problematic.
but then Don and Cordell do challenge that. They
We already
work.
read that.
So let's go back to the question, do we need both Dunning?
I don't think so.
I kind of think that they're more similar than they are different. And if I had to pick one, I think I would go with Cordell because I think it's been selling. I think that Twist, his homelessness story.
The only trouble with that I foresee is individualizing. Like it makes it much easier to individualize the
I'd say that was
issues
his.
than. I mean, I don't know that like what is the magic number to like not individualize stories,
More than one.
but I do think it's easier when you have two, even if they're similar or
Similarities
precisely
understood.
because they're similar.
So could you cut down, John, and just do a couple of clips as opposed to make them equal?
Yeah.
It is less. It's not equal.
Yeah.
Get rid of dopamine and have John and Cordell. I mean, you could do any of these things, right? Like you can think about having. I'm not saying you should do that, but like you could
So
also.
let me say a bit about what I liked about dopamine that I felt like it added. So I'm really interested in individual. And you saw a very different sense of the community in dopamine. And even the woman who ended up calling herself his wife or his, you know, and so a lot of what happened in terms of service and how that played out, I thought that there was an awful lot of rich material there to think about family and relationships that you didn't get.
Yeah.
But,
Because there was a first person mentioned.
but what you're saying, I mean, our portrait is about homeless veterans, not homelessness in general. So maybe it would make more sense to focus on the veterans, right? Because if that's what you're getting out of dopamine.
Well, they were veterans. They just
No,
weren't.
Carter was
they
a
were
veteran.
Yeah,
veterans.
Carter was a
Veterans,
veteran, and you
right.
had that
And so
whole
was Peter,
military
yeah.
burial at the end, like
Right.
reading
Carter
about
was a veteran.
all
Yeah,
of
they were
that.
veterans. They just weren't
Right.
combat veterans.
Right.
Or wartime
But
veterans.
the fact that you're saying that's not what you got out of it, that you got out like these like invisible communities and that kind of thing, like which is interesting, it's not exactly relevant to our portrait.
I don't know. What I like is that they are gross in Righteous Dope Fiend, but they're not. But they're still human. Dope Fiend simultaneously takes on these stereotypes, complicates them, and it's really multi-layered, right? And the guys in the videos are not. They're likable. They're all of these things. So the contrast between them really sort of helps us unpack what homelessness is. Like
Yeah.
I agree with that.
And my discomfort is their grossness is I'm using your term through the lens of an ethnographer, and that is what makes me uncomfortable. If we could have found first person narratives through which we could see that, I would feel much more comfortable. And I think where I'm feeling discomfort is that as an ethnographer, I know how much we are the filter through which we've decided to show that, and so it makes me
include that as a
uncomfortable.
question.
So I mean,
but this is also going to be what physicians experience.
Yeah, but the interviewer also, I mean, those are filtered
no,
too.
100%.
Yeah.
I get that. I guess that so I guess I just feel that just makes me uncomfortable. It's all first person narrative. I and not first person and all of that. And so I know these are all your distinctions, but I guess I just feel
We
like
can
that's
draw
making
that
me
out.
uncomfortable.
We can draw that out because all narratives are crafted, right? Yeah.
100%.
And so, and your point, they're saying that the oral histories are crafted too. What they do and don't talk about.
And we
so
we have clips too. I mean,
yeah.
we're crafting these as well.
So making that an explicit part of the discussion is, I think.
And we chose the clips.
Yeah.
So it's another. So not only was the interviewer only asking certain questions and not others, but then we excerpt the clips. Yeah.
Well, couldn't you? I mean, because it's ultimately about representation.
Right.
How is homelessness represented? And the cultural grammar, back to that phrase, right, that informs representations. I mean, so it could just be one way of like pulling out for a moment and saying, we're looking at how homelessness is represented in the bedroom.
Remember paying attention.
I am. I'm writing. I'm taking notes.
Oh, yeah.
I'm
And
I
writing
like that.
some.
we didn't even, I mean, this is a photo
Yeah.
ethnography,
But
right?
all
So there's
portraits are
tons.
representations.
Right. Well, actually, that's what I felt was so compelling. Actually, like the one, like this photograph, I thought was so powerful.
The one going
This one.
Yeah. Oh God, that
was
was.
so
Which one?
powerful.
Here's
Oh, the
exactly
picture?
what it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the other really cool thing about this book is it's a photographic ethnography as well as a traditional. It's like an amazing book.
What?
It is. It's really. I mean, thank you to Allie for
Yeah.
telling us
I'm
to
not
read it.
Yeah, I
critiquing.
forgot.
I'm not critiquing it as a concept.
Yeah.
I want to make that very
Yeah.
clear.
Yeah. No, we're talking about pedagogy. It's good.
So what else? This is helpful.
So we just have to make decisions about. We need to get rid of something. Maybe is what you're saying. But what that is another question.
So
I would just vote with Allie. I think that I think I'm voting with Allie, which is that I think that piece, I agreed that piece was really
Yeah.
helpful, but that maybe we didn't need to make them read it.
Which one, right?
the right.
Right.
That's interesting. Yeah. Okay. What about
That took me the most time.
Me too.
it is long.
Yeah.
It is long, and
It's
it's
deceptive. You're like, oh, it's only a couple of pages, but
Yeah,
it's
and
that
it's-
horrid format.
Tight read.
I mean, it's a really great piece, but I was like, oh, I
Fair
remember
enough.
why I hate these column pieces.
Oh, that's it. The visual format. That makes sense. Yeah, no, that could be. I mean, that could be an we could cover much of that in the introductory stuff, and not get rid of it.
But you like the idea of a PowerPoint as an introduction. Was that effective?
I have a suggestion to change that slightly, because one of the things that kept coming up was that we were talking about these assumptions about what it means to be homeless, who the people are, which is largely informed by the history. So could you possibly start with a 5-minute activity of what are your stereotypes,
Yeah.
and then
there, and then you
use the historical piece to
Or what have you
This
seen?
is
Yeah,
what-
like
this is what I
where
said
have you
to
lived
Cindy.
and what have you seen?
I was like, what? My first question was, well, what do you
Oh,
think
yeah,
of when you
you
think of
did.
somebody who's
I was like,
homeless?
oh,
And Cindy's like, oh, I hate that question.
It's that kind of thing all the time. I think it's great.
And then I thought that the third item of discussion
That's
should be
just
the
me,
first.
though.
We should talk about,
But
what
it
is
might
it,
be
stigma?
Like,
Well,
That's the first question. The third question is stigma and.
But they don't have to share. You could have them write what they think. They don't even have to share it either. You can, and so who knows what's happening, but hopefully you're blowing away all their stereotypes.
I
during
kind
the
of like
session.
that idea. I like that
Also-
better. that
But
you
then
don't
you're not
share.
forcing them to be like, oh, I think of a homeless
Sure.
Yeah, like
And
I'm
then-
reporting back.
who's a person of color, and they have to like say those
Yeah.
things.
But
Yeah.
you could also
Well-
give the teacher the option.
Yeah, you
We also
could.
acknowledge that
And
some of our
it also
students
depends
have
too
been
if it's like a one-time session of
Should
students
probably
or
also know.
students that know each other and have a trusted group dynamic.
Or as a
like-
concluding exercise, say, okay, now take what you wrote at the beginning and look at it again.
Oh, that's a good idea.
What do you think?
Or what has
Are there
changed?
things that you think about what you
Yeah.
wrote then that have changed, or is this consistent with it, or and then give them the opportunity to share?
I like that.
Yeah, if they want to,
That's
or
interesting.
5 minutes reflect on the changes.
'Cause
and
that-
do a
that's
little
right.
reflective writing, and then if they want to.
One thing I like about not necessarily forcing everyone to share, but having some ideas and also framing it in this is not what you think about we're homeless, but what are the stereotypes? Then you can touch on all of those in the historical piece. Say, all right, here is where this part of that narrative came.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So not
So that's-
not
What
just
have you
what are the
seen in
stereotypes,
movies?
but
What
why
have
are
you
the
seen?
stereotypes?
Yeah.
Why?
Oh, I think you would just ask what the stereotypes are, and then you
Yeah, then you pull it.
and then you answer the why.
So that's the question we asked there is very delicate. It's not there are 3 different questions here. There, one is what do you think of when you think of a homeless person? Another is what do we as a people or as a culture think a homeless person looks like? And the third is what are the common stereotypes of homelessness? And any one of those could be effective, but they all are slightly different.
The one piece that makes me feel anxious about this is that I couldn't do that nearly as well as a historian. And I was sitting there at the beginning of this, and just this, for some reason I feel this way only really about the history section more than I do about the other. I feel like I can fake it in some of the other social things and even in literature. But for some reason in history, it's like I feel like somebody's gonna ask me a question like Christy did about FDR, and I'm gonna go, I don't freaking
Yeah,
know.
but so
Well, I didn't
so
know.
would I.
But
Because historians don't know every single
that's
bit of history.
true. No, but that's
written
true. But
ever.
so what do we do in those situations? Like, how is that?
You deflect it back to critical social reasoning. No, you do. You say, you know, that's a really good question, and I don't know the answer to that. But it does raise these questions about shifting obligations of the state to individuals and how it evolves over time.
So okay, so number one, everybody pulls it out of their ass. That's what I'm hearing. But number two, the framing.
No, that's not pulling it out of your ass. It's acknowledging like the limits of your knowledge and emphasis and redirecting to the point, which isn't historical facts, but which is critical listening.
But the framing is about historical facts. That's why I'm uncomfortable.
No,
the first that talk to me was a historical talk. Am I wrong in having
Right,
heard
but
that?
he prefaced it by saying we are doing historical analytic reasoning, or we're taking this historical lens. And then he just gave this as sort of a preface or a background, but that the discussion was supposed to be, and the way we're approaching it is through this analytic lens. A historical analytic.
Should we talk more about that lens at the beginning, DJ?
I'd be curious to know what you mean by historical system, because I think it's a really important concept here to get to be able to go back and forth between particularity and then also being able to take a step back. So what does historical distance mean to the historian?
Well, my confession here is that I don't actually think we're doing a very good job of doing history.
I would agree with that. I can do all of this really well. I feel really confident with this because this feels like sociology to me or anthropology very comfortably. The piece I don't feel comfortable with is the historical lens. And so that was the piece I felt like happened at the beginning. I don't think it's not historicized sociology, but I think it's sociology.
Yeah,
so I think that's the piece that I'm uncomfortable with is because I feel like
so this is where I pushed at the beginning where I said how would this have been different in 1920? What else was going on in the late 20th century that would have so that was the history.
So are you saying you're uncomfortable because if outside of Matt and what he gave, or somebody like you're uncomfortable with another faculty person being expected to lay this out without having done a lot more?
That's my concern. How could I give like that frame to make it history
or
and
anybody
not all
else
of a
in
sudden,
that context
right?
that doesn't have that back.
Exactly. That's my concern.
And that,
I think that's going to be that's going to be a problem of all of the portraits being taught by people who are not that kind of scholar.
Right.
And so the teaching guide is just that. It's a guide. But if you are the teacher for that particular colloquia or whatever, but you're not a historian or you're not a literary scholar or whatever, you still have the ability to interject your own take on things, and you can change things. And you can. It's just a guide, right? So.
Can I ask the other reading? What is it? Whatever we're calling suggested or the
alternative?
Is that so? That's an alternative of. That's a list of what else they can assign to the students. What about like a section that you read up on stuff, like having for the somebody that's like
most of what that is.
Yeah,
distinguishing what might be alternative readings in the classroom versus what a faculty person should be suggested to read up on.
Alternate readings versus
to be prepared for.
Yeah. We merge
readings
those
versus
two,
supplemental
but
readings.
we need to disaggregate them.
Yeah, alternate.
That's absolutely true.
Yeah, then you can.
Then you don't feel safe
But
enough in that. Here's a
it's true
support.
but let's be realistic. What faculty person is actually going to read up on stuff? Nobody. I mean, because
I don't know,
people are saying it's going to get through what we assigned here. So it's very unlikely.
Oh, but the performance is different.
Yeah.
If I'm going to be
that's
standing in
true.
front of 15 students,
Good.
right, staring at me.
Absolutely.
Right here, I'm staring at a bunch of colleagues, right, that I trust.
And you're not teaching it.
Yeah.
You're the student.
So it's a different dynamic.
I think you're right. Yes. Good point.
I would read the shit out of that stuff.
Great. I don't
Excuse
go
me,
to crime
I'm
class.
So we have 10 minutes.
One other thing, I think it would be helpful to someone like
the changes in language around talking about homelessness, specifically in framing people as homeless versus people experiencing homelessness, and how those are used differently and by different people. Been a very significant push in the past couple of years to change that framing, and then also with the marginally housed versus like instably housed and all of those other terms, just to acknowledge the evolution of language and allow people to be more fluent navigating conversations.
And just to flag that the terminology might change from when the teaching guide gets posted to 3 years from now when somebody picks it up. Like just something that like flags, like make sure you're, like maybe some of the prep is, what are the current terms?
Yeah, I think that's important. The other thing is the glossary, if you alert, like knowing that like if that's there ahead of time.
Like while you're doing the reading.
Yeah, because you're not gonna get to the guide until the very. You're not gonna,
I would
Where does it say?
Is
Where
it?
does
Is
it
it
say in the
say?
guide that it's there?
I thought
It was supposed to be in there. I feel
It
like
is.
I just
I
looked
don't
at the
see it.
like I look at the
Maybe
reading
I-
list to determine what I'm supposed to do.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I
don't look
something
at
so
how this-
fast
oh,
and
it
then dive
does
in.
say
Yeah.
In the section that says how to use this guide.
Page 4.
Turns out this guide is 13 pages long, so it adds
Honest-
to the reading that you have
yeah.
to do for this thing.
Well,
which is-
no.
Well, but as a
the
faculty, but like the student
no,
doesn't
I
get
know.
this.
So something
Yeah.
to think about for what a student would, what you would want to put for a student.
So that's why you want to put the glossary here,
Right.
to say that.
So we actually decided
Or
not to put
no?
the glossary at the beginning because we feared that people would just read the glossary. It would take
It's
forever to read the
Oh.
saying
glossary.
in the reading
In the
list,
reading
not
Oh,
in the
reading
teaching
list.
guide.
Oh,
Right?
I
So
see.
you move
Yeah, because like when
back
I
to
look
the
at this
guide.
stuff, I usually look at this first and assume I'm a student and I'm like preparing for the
Exactly.
class, and I don't look at this really until like we come here.
So maybe the glossary should be in the supplementary readings.
So that might have helped
or just attached
navigate.
to the reading list.
So
But
one
I
other
don't
thing
know.
I would
You're
just
kinda
sort
right.
of
You don't want
say,
people to
and I
just,
don't know
like-
that this is incorrect or whatever, but from my lens, the word stigma was a trigger for me. Like I was sort of expecting something different in the discussion based on the fact that we use the word stigma.
Yeah, we use it very fast.
Yeah, so I would just say I'm not sure it's wrong, but it feels under theorized, and so it seems like we're more talking about stereotypes here, or something else.
Well,
So yeah,
Well, to that point though, the spoiled identity, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you could. There's a way in which we could really make that term work.
right.
With
Well,
some
we brought
simple,
it up.
yeah,
Right.
the spoiled identity, and there are the 3 ways that could happen, that kind of thing, right? And the homelessness is this way or whatever.
Right.
Yeah, so to bring out the spoiled identity part of Goffman.
If you're gonna talk
I
about
think that's
stigma,
right.
if you're gonna talk about stigma, I think I would put it in there explicitly in that sub theme,
I think that's a
or
good
as
idea.
a teaching guide, or I would take it out and just
Yeah.
talk about stereotypes.
So
Fine.
making one of the background readings something that addresses this, and then incorporating explicitly
For the faculty,
For the
I don't think
faculty,
you need,
yes,
yeah,
yes,
yeah,
yes,
for
yes.
sure,
for
for
the
sure.
faculty.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
And perhaps even, talking about the othering or whatever, which is happening there. Those are all